Sometimes the world tells you you're too old, too worn, too late to start over. Margaret Holloway heard those words every day in Cedar Falls, a frontier town where a woman of 43 was considered past her usefulness. She'd come west hoping for a second chance, maybe a kind man who needed a partner more than a young bride. But every door closed in her face. The men looked right through her, and the women whispered behind their hands. For 3 long weeks, she lived in a boarding house, invisible and unwanted. Then a small orphan girl named Sarah, no more than 10 years old, stood up in the town square and said, "She'll be our mother." What did that child see that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stage had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, rattling into Cedar Falls with a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a veil between Margaret Holloway and her past. She'd stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk with her worn carpetbag in one hand, and a faded tin-type photograph tucked safely in her coat pocket, the only images she had, left of her husband Thomas and their daughter Emma, both taken by scarlet fever 5 years ago in a single devastating week. Margaret was 43 years old, though she felt ancient some days and remarkably young on others. Her hair had begun to silver at the temples, fine lines creased the corners of her eyes, and her hands showed the wear of hard work and harder losses. But her back was straight, her mind sharp, and her heart, despite everything, still believed in the possibility of purpose. Cedar Falls was not a large town, but it had the essential elements of frontier civilization. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church with a modest steeple, a schoolhouse at the edge of town, and the ever-present saloon, where men gathered to drink away their loneliness or celebrate their fortunes. The surrounding landscape rolled out in gentle hills covered with scrub brush and the occasional stand of cottonwoods following the creek that gave the town its name. She'd chosen Cedar Falls from a newspaper advertisement back in St. Louis. Opportunities for settlers in growing Western community. Land available. New beginnings possible. The words had spoken to something desperate in her soul. After Thomas and Emma died, she'd stayed with her sister's family for 3 years, helping with the housework and the children, trying to be useful. But she'd felt like a ghost in their home, a reminder of loss, always in the way despite their kindness, when her sister's husband had gently suggested that perhaps Margaret might find her own situation, maybe a position as a housekeeper or companion to an elderly woman she'd understood. She was a burden, a middle-aged widow with no prospects and no purpose. So she'd saved what little she could from her sewing work, sold the few possessions that remained from her marriage, and bought a ticket west. The boarding house was run by Ruth McAllister, a weathered woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Ruth had shown Margaret to a small room on the 2nd floor, clean but sparse, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the back alley. "You're here for the matrimonial prospects, I expect," Ruth had said, not unkindly. "Most women who come alone are." Margaret had nodded, feeling the heat of shame in her cheeks. "I'd hoped there might be a widower, perhaps. Someone who values companionship and partnership over youth and childbearing," Ruth had finished bluntly. "Well, I won't lie to you, Mrs. Holloway. This is a hard town for a woman of your years. The men here, the ones looking for wives, they want young women who can give them children and work the land for decades to come. They see marriage as a practical arrangement, not a romantic one." "I understand practical," Margaret had said quietly. "I was married for 15 years. I know what partnership means." Ruth had studied her for a long moment, then patted her arm. "You have a good bearing about you, dignified. That counts for something. But don't set your hopes too high, dear. That's all I'm saying." The first Sunday, Margaret had attended church services at the white clapboard building on the north end of town. She'd worn her best dress, dark grey wool, properly modest, showing her respect for the Lord and the community. She'd arrived early and taken a seat toward the back, folding her hands in her lap and keeping her eyes forward. The congregation had filtered in slowly. Families with children, young couples, older married pairs who'd built their lives together. She'd felt the eyes on her, curious, assessing, dismissing. When the service ended and people gathered outside to socialize, she'd approached a group of women standing in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Good morning," she'd said with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret Holloway. I arrived in town a few days ago and wanted to introduce myself." The women had exchanged glances. One of them, a handsome woman in her 30s with an elaborate hat, had nodded coolly. "Mrs. Adelaide Porter. I run the Silver Dollar Saloon." She'd gestured to the others. "Mrs. Brennan, Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Calhoun. It's a pleasure to meet you all," Margaret had said. "It's a lovely town you have here. Looking for a husband, are you?" Mrs. Calhoun had asked bluntly. She was a pinched woman with tight lips and suspicious eyes. "I'm hoping to make a new start," Margaret had replied carefully. "Whether that includes marriage or simply finding useful work and a place to belong?" "Well," Mrs. Calhoun had said, her tone making clear what she thought of Margaret's prospects, "I'm sure you'll find something." The other women had offered polite but distant smiles, then turned back to their own conversations. Margaret had stood there for another moment, feeling the weight of exclusion, before quietly walking back toward the boarding house. That pattern had repeated itself throughout her first 3 weeks in Cedar Falls. She'd presented herself at the general store, offering her skills as a seamstress. The owner, Mr. Hawkins, had looked her over and said he'd keep her in mind, but never sent any work her way. She'd inquired at the hotel about a position in the kitchen or doing laundry. The manager had told her they had all the help they needed. She'd even attended the town's weekly social gathering in the square, where people brought food to share and the young people danced to fiddle music. She'd stood on the periphery, watching the life of the community flow around her like water around a stone. The young women giggled and flirted. The matrons gossiped and supervised. The men talked business and politics. And Margaret stood alone, growing more invisible with each passing day. The rejection wasn't cruel exactly. No one was openly hostile. But there was a coldness, a dismissiveness that hurt more than anger would have. She was simply irrelevant. Too old to be interesting, too old to be useful, too old to matter. She'd learned the social hierarchy quickly. At the top were the established families, those who'd been in Cedar Falls for a decade or more, who owned property and businesses. The Brennans, for instance. Sheriff Tom Brennan was a man in his early 50s, respected and steady, married to a pleasant woman who seemed content with her position. Then came the newer settlers who were building their stakes, like Adelaide Porter. Adelaide was a widow herself, though younger than Margaret, and she'd managed to establish herself as a businesswoman through a combination of shrewd dealing and the advantage of youth that made people trust her ambitions. Below them were the working families, the laborers, the drifters, and at the very bottom, barely noticed at all, were the orphans. Cedar Falls had an orphanage on the eastern edge of town, run by a man named Josiah Calhoun, husband to the suspicious Mrs. Calhoun Margaret had met at church. The orphanage was housed in a long, low building that had once been a storage warehouse, converted with minimal comfort into dormitories for children who'd lost their parents to disease, accidents, or the general hardships of frontier life. Margaret had first noticed the children one morning when she'd been walking past the schoolhouse. A group of them had been lined up outside, waiting to go in for lessons. They were easy to identify. The orphans wore cast-off clothes that didn't quite fit, and they had a particular look about them, a wariness in their eyes that came from learning early that the world was not a kind place. One girl in particular had caught Margaret's attention. She was small and slight, with tangled brown hair and a face that would have been pretty if it hadn't been so pinched with hunger and worry. The girl had been standing slightly apart from the others, holding a book against her chest like a shield. Their eyes had met for just a moment, and Margaret had seen something in that child's gaze that pierced straight through to her heart. A desperate intelligence, a fierce spirit barely contained, and a loneliness that mirrored her own. She'd smiled at the girl, a genuine smile of recognition and warmth. The girl had blinked, surprised, then looked away quickly as if afraid to hope for kindness. That moment had stayed with Margaret all day. That night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, she'd thought about Emma. Her daughter would have been 15 now if she'd lived. Would she have had that same fierce spirit? That same hunger for what? Love, belonging, purpose? Margaret's savings were running low. Ruth charged fair rates for the room, but even fair rates added up when there was no income to balance them. She'd done some mending work for Ruth in exchange for a reduction in rent, but that couldn't continue indefinitely. She had perhaps another month, maybe 6 weeks if she was very careful, before she'd have to leave Cedar Falls and try somewhere else. The thought filled her with a bone-deep weariness. How many towns would she pass through? How many times would she be assessed and found wanting before she accepted that there was no place for her in this world? She'd taken to walking in the evenings when the light turned gold and the air cooled. The land around Cedar Falls was beautiful in its own stark way. The endless sky, the rolling hills, the stubborn plants that managed to thrive despite the harsh conditions. She'd always loved growing things. In her marriage, she'd kept a garden that was the envy of their neighborhood, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers that brought color and life to their small yard. That was another skill she had, knowledge of plants, their properties, their uses. She could create tinctures and salves for common ailments. She could preserve food, pickle vegetables, make soap from ashes and lard. She could read and write and do figures. She could manage a household efficiently and economically. She could cook meals that were nourishing and flavorful even from simple ingredients, but none of that seemed to matter. The men who needed wives looked at her graying hair and saw only the years she'd already lived, not the years of experience and capability those years represented. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks into her stay, a widower named Jacob Mills had approached her at the general store. He was a decent-looking man in his mid-40s, weathered from outdoor work, with kind eyes and a hesitant manner. "Mrs. Holloway," he'd said, removing his hat, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Her heart had leaped with hope. "Of course, Mr. Mills." They'd stepped outside, away from the ears of other shoppers. Jacob had cleared his throat several times before speaking. "I've been a widower for near on 3 years now. My wife died giving birth to our 4th child, and the baby didn't make it either. I've got 3 children at home, boys, ages 6, 9, and 11. I work a farm about 5 miles north of here. I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret had said sincerely. "Thank you, ma'am. The thing is, I need help. The boys are running wild without a mother's influence, and I can't keep up with the housework and the farm both. I've been thinking I should maybe remarry. For practical purposes." Margaret had nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral, even as hope and disappointment warred in her chest. "I know you're a widow yourself," Jacob had continued, "and I've heard you're a capable woman. I thought perhaps we might come to an arrangement. You'd have a home and security. I'd have help with the household and the boys. It wouldn't be, that is to say, I wouldn't expect," he'd colored slightly. "It would be more of a business arrangement. Separate rooms, respectful, but practical." Margaret had taken a breath, feeling the sting of tears she refused to shed. "Mr. Mills, I appreciate your honesty, but I'm looking for more than a position as a housekeeper. I've already lived a marriage built on genuine partnership and affection. I'm not willing to settle for less than that, even if it means I remain alone." Jacob had looked relieved, actually, as if he'd expected her to jump at the offer. "I understand, ma'am. No hard feelings. None at all," she'd assured him. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He tipped his hat and walked away, and Margaret had stood there on the boardwalk, watching him go, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. Wasn't practical security better than nothing? Wasn't usefulness better than invisibility? But no. She'd had love once, real love, and she wouldn't dishonor Thomas's memory or her own dignity by accepting a marriage that was really just domestic servitude with legal papers attached. That evening, Ruth had brought her a cup of tea and sat down in the boarding house parlor with her. "I heard about Jacob Mills," she'd said. Margaret had managed a rueful smile. "News travels fast. In a town this size?" "Always." Ruth had sipped her own tea. You did right turning him down. Jacob's not a bad man, but he'd have worked you into the ground and never seen you as anything more than a convenience. I'm beginning to think convenience is all I have to offer." Margaret had said quietly. Ruth had reached over and patted her hand. "You're worth more than that. Any fool with eyes could see it. The problem is, this town is full of fools." They'd sat in companionable silence for a while. Then Ruth had said, "You've noticed the orphans, haven't you? I've seen you watching them." "Hard not to notice them," Margaret had replied. "They seem forgotten. They are forgotten. Oh, Calhoun gets a stipend from the territorial government for each child, and he provides the bare minimum: roof over their heads, enough food to keep them alive, basic schooling. But there's no love in that place, no warmth. The children are just inventory to him." "That's terrible," Margaret had said, feeling her heart clench. "It is. Some of the children get fostered out to families in town, but that's not always better. The families get a small payment for taking them in, and some see it as free labor. The children work hard and get little in return." Ruth had looked at her directly. "That girl you saw at the schoolhouse, the one with the book, that's Sarah Brennan. No relation to the sheriff, mind you. She's had a harder time than most. Been passed around to 4 different families in the past 2 years. None of them could handle her." "Handle her? She's just a child. She's got spirit. She asks questions. She wants to learn. She talks back when she's treated unfairly. Some folks see that as defiance. They want quiet, obedient children who don't cause trouble." Margaret had felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Where is she now?" "With the Gundersons. Hans and Ingrid. They've got a farm west of town. They take in orphans for the extra income, but they're not kind people, strict, hard. The last girl they had ran away twice before Calhoun finally placed her elsewhere." That night, Margaret had taken out the tin-type photograph of Thomas and Emma and held it in her hands, studying their faces in the lamplight. Thomas's steady gaze, Emma's bright smile, the love they'd shared, the family they'd been. "I don't know what to do," she'd whispered to the image. "I came here hoping to find a new purpose, but I'm no closer than I was in St. Louis. Maybe I'm foolish for thinking I have anything left to give." But even as she said it, she thought of that little girl, Sarah, with her fierce eyes and her book held like a shield, and she felt something shift in her heart. Not all purposes came in the forms we expected. Not all families were built on blood. She'd fallen asleep that night with the photograph under her pillow and a strange sense that something was about to change. Though she couldn't have said what or how, the answer would come 3 days later in the town square, when a child's voice would cut through the murmur of judgment and whisper and change everything. The Saturday social gathering was a weekly tradition in Cedar Falls, held in the town square when weather permitted. Families brought food to share, spreading blankets on the ground or claiming spots at the long tables someone had built years ago for just this purpose. The men congregated near the far end, discussing crops and cattle prices and territorial politics. The women clustered in smaller groups, keeping eyes on children while exchanging news and recipes and judgment in equal measure. Margaret had come because Ruth had insisted. "You can't hide in your room forever," Ruth had said that morning. "People need to see you being part of the community, even if they're too foolish to welcome you properly." So Margaret had come, bringing a loaf of bread she'd baked in Ruth's kitchen. Good bread, with a golden crust and a tender crumb. The kind that came from years of practice and an understanding of how flour and yeast and time worked together. She'd placed it on the communal table with the other offerings, noting how the women nearby had glanced at it, then at her, then turned away without comment. She'd found a spot at the edge of the gathering, on a bench near the schoolhouse, where she could observe without being in anyone's way. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and she'd closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of community, laughter, conversation, children playing, and feeling the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people yet utterly alone. That's when she'd heard the sharp voice cutting through the general noise. "You stupid, clumsy girl, look what you've done." Margaret's eyes had snapped open. Across the square, near one of the food tables, a woman was berating a child. The woman was tall and raw-boned, with a hard face and hands planted on her hips. The child was small and thin, wearing a dress that was too short and had been mended many times, the patches visible even from a distance. It was Sarah, the girl from the schoolhouse, the one with the book and the fierce eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Gunderson," Sarah was saying, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Mrs. Gunderson's voice rose. "You've spilled half the stew on the ground. Do you know how much work went into making that? Do you know how much it costs to feed a useless mouth like yours?" Sarah's face had gone very pale, but her chin lifted in defiance. "I said I was sorry. I tripped on the—" "Don't you dare talk back to me!" Mrs. Gunderson raised her hand, and several people nearby turned to watch, their conversations faltering. Margaret was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She'd crossed the square quickly but with dignity, her heart pounding with an anger she hadn't felt in years. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying clearly. "Is there a problem?" Mrs. Gunderson turned, her hand still raised, her face flushed with anger. "This is none of your concern, Mrs. Whoever you are." "Holloway," Margaret said evenly. "Margaret Holloway. And I couldn't help but notice that you're about to strike a child in public. She's my responsibility," Mrs. Gunderson snapped. "I'll discipline her as I see fit." "She's a child who had an accident," Margaret replied. Her voice was still calm, but there was steel in it now. "Accidents happen, especially when children are asked to carry heavy pots while navigating crowded spaces." Sarah was staring at Margaret with wide eyes, surprise and something like hope flickering across her face. "The girl is clumsy and careless," Mrs. Gunderson said. She needs to learn that mistakes are part of being human," Margaret interrupted quietly. "And that correction can be given without cruelty." A small crowd had gathered now, watching the exchange. Margaret could feel their eyes, their judgment, but she didn't care. All she could see was this child, this small, brave child, standing there with her fists clenched and her eyes bright with unshed tears, trying so hard not to show how much the words had hurt. Mrs. Gunderson's face had gone an ugly red. "How dare you presume to tell me?" "I dare because someone should," Margaret said, and now there was heat in her voice despite her best efforts to remain controlled. "That child is in your care, not your possession. She deserves to be treated with basic human decency. She's an orphan," Mrs. Gunderson spat. "She should be grateful for any home at all, even if she has to work for it." The words hung in the air, revealing more than Mrs. Gunderson had perhaps intended. Around them, some people looked uncomfortable. Others nodded in agreement. Margaret felt sick. "Come here, child," Margaret said softly to Sarah. Sarah looked at Mrs. Gunderson, clearly torn between fear and desire. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sarah took a small step toward Margaret, then another, until she was standing close enough that Margaret could see the bruise on her arm, poorly hidden by her sleeve, and the scrape on her knee that was still bleeding slightly from where she must have fallen. "Let me look at that knee," Margaret said, kneeling down, despite the dust on the ground. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket. She always carried two, a habit from her years as a mother, and gently dabbed at the scrape. Sarah flinched, but didn't pull away. Up close, Margaret could see how thin the girl was, how her dress hung on her frame, how her hair needed washing and proper care. But she could also see the intelligence in those brown eyes, the spirit that hadn't quite been beaten down yet, the desperate hunger for kindness. "There," Margaret said softly. "That's better. It's not too deep. It should heal fine if you keep it clean." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "You're very welcome." Margaret stood, aware that she was making a scene, aware that this would have consequences, but unable to stop herself. She looked at Mrs. Gunderson. "Perhaps you should take a moment to collect yourself before continuing with the social gathering." Mrs. Gunderson's mouth opened and closed, fury and humiliation warring on her face. Then she turned sharply and stalked away, leaving Sarah standing there between Margaret and the watching crowd. Margaret took Sarah's hand, small and cold in hers, and led her to the bench where she'd been sitting earlier. They sat down together, and for a moment neither spoke. Margaret could feel her own hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and anger. "You shouldn't have done that," Sarah said finally. "She'll make it worse for me later." "Then she's even more of a fool than I thought," Margaret replied. "No one deserves to be spoken to that way, especially not a child." Sarah studied her with those two old eyes. "You're the lady who came to town alone, the one everyone talks about." "I suppose I am. They say you're too old to get married." "That no one wants you." Margaret managed a small smile despite the sting of those words. "They say that, do they? Are you sad about it?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted, "but not as sad as I am about other things, like seeing children treated as if they don't matter." Sarah was quiet for a moment, picking at a thread on her dress. "My mother died when I was 5, she said softly. "Fever took her. My father tried to keep us together, me and my 2 brothers, but then he got hurt in a mining accident. Couldn't work anymore. He died 2 years later. I think from sadness as much as from his injuries." "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. My brothers got adopted right away. They were younger and boys are more useful, I guess. I've been at the orphanage ever since, or with families that take orphans for the money." She looked up at Margaret. "Mrs. Gunderson is the worst so far. She makes me sleep in the barn when I make her mad." Margaret's heart clenched. "That's not right. That's not—" She stopped, forcing herself to stay calm. "Does Mr. Calhoun know about this?" Sarah shrugged. "He doesn't care. As long as we're not dead, he doesn't care." They sat together in silence, watching the social gathering continue around them. People had gone back to their conversations, though Margaret noticed many glances thrown their way. She'd made herself even more of an outsider today, she knew, interfering in another family's business, defending an orphan against her foster family. These were not things that would endear her to the community, but looking at Sarah's profile, seeing the way the girl sat a little straighter now, a little less defeated, Margaret found she didn't regret it. "Not for a moment. Do you like to read?" Margaret asked after a while. Sarah's face lit up. "Yes, I love reading. The school teacher, Miss Whitmore, she lets me borrow books sometimes. I read them over and over." "What are you reading now?" "A book of poetry. I don't understand all of it, but some of the words are so beautiful. They make me feel—" She paused, searching for the right description. "Like there's something bigger than all this, something better." "I used to read poetry to my daughter," Margaret said softly. "She loved it too. Where is she now?" "She died 5 years ago. She was only 10 years old." Sarah looked at her with sudden understanding. "The same age as me. Yes, the same age as you." They sat there together as the afternoon wore on, and gradually Margaret became aware that they were being watched more intently than before. Other children from the orphanage had drifted closer, curious and wary. A few adults looked on with expressions ranging from disapproval to thoughtful consideration. Sheriff Brennan approached, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Holloway," he said respectfully, "that was a brave thing you did." "It was a necessary thing," Margaret replied. "No more than that," he nodded slowly. "Still, not many would have stepped in." He looked at Sarah. "You all right, girl?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said quietly. "You let me know if there's any trouble from the Gundersons beyond the normal—" He paused, seeming to realize what he was about to say. "That is, if things get worse." "Thank you, Sheriff." He nodded to Margaret and walked away, but his words hung in the air, beyond the normal, as if cruelty was normal, as if it was acceptable, as long as it didn't cross some invisible line. The sun was starting to lower in the sky when Sarah finally spoke again. "I should go back. Mrs. Gunderson will be looking for me. And if I'm not there when she wants to leave, I understand." Margaret hesitated, then said, "Sarah, if you're ever in trouble, you can find me at the boarding house, Mrs. McAllister's place. Do you know it?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm usually there in the evenings." "Or you could leave a message with Ruth." Sarah nodded, but there was skepticism in her eyes, the look of a child who'd learned not to count on adult promises. She stood to go, then turned back. "Why did you help me?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Because you reminded me of someone I loved very much, and because it was the right thing to do. No one else thought so. Then no one else was paying proper attention." Sarah smiled then, just a small quirk of her lips, but it transformed her whole face for a moment. Then she was gone, walking across the square to where Mrs. Gunderson stood, waiting with arms crossed and a thunderous expression. Margaret watched her go, feeling something shift and settle in her chest. She'd come to Cedar Falls looking for a place to belong, for a purpose, for a reason to keep living beyond simple survival. She'd thought perhaps she'd find it in marriage, in partnership with a man who needed what she could offer. But maybe, just maybe, purpose came in different forms than she'd expected. The next morning, Margaret was having breakfast in the boarding house dining room when Ruth sat down across from her with a knowing look. "You've got people talking," Ruth said. "I imagine I do. Some think you overstepped, that you had no right to interfere with how the Gundersons managed their household. And the others?" Ruth smiled. "The others think maybe someone needed to say something, that maybe we've all been turning blind eyes for too long." Margaret sipped her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. "What do you think?" "I think," Ruth said slowly, "that you might have just found your purpose in this town, whether the town is ready for it or not." 3 days later, Margaret was walking back from the general store when she heard running footsteps behind her. She turned to see Sarah, out of breath and wide-eyed, her face flushed from exertion. "Mrs. Holloway," Sarah gasped. I have to slow down, sweetheart. Catch your breath." Sarah bent over, hands on her knees, pulling in air. When she straightened, there were tears on her cheeks. "It's getting worse. Mrs. Gunderson, after what happened at the social, she's been—" The girl's voice broke. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "Come with me, right now." She took Sarah's hand and walked directly to the sheriff's office. Tom Brennan looked up from his desk in surprise as they entered. "Sheriff," Margaret said firmly, "we need to talk about the Gunderson household and the treatment of this child." And just like that, despite all her careful planning and hopes for a quiet new beginning, Margaret Holloway stepped into the current of a fight she hadn't known she was looking for. But standing there with Sarah's small hand in hers, she knew with absolute certainty that it was a fight worth having. The town square gathering had been 3 days ago. This morning, in the sheriff's office, with a frightened child beside her and a growing sense of righteous determination, Margaret's real life in Cedar Falls was finally beginning. The morning after Margaret's visit to the sheriff's office, word spread through Cedar Falls like water finding cracks in stone. By noon, everyone knew that the widow woman, the one too old for marriage, had dared to challenge the Gundersons about their treatment of their foster child. Opinions divided sharply. Margaret was mending a tear in one of Ruth's tablecloths when the first visitor arrived. She heard the knock, then Ruth's voice, then footsteps on the stairs. Ruth appeared in the doorway of Margaret's room with an uncertain expression. "Adelaide Porter is here to see you," Ruth said. "She's waiting in the parlor." Margaret set down her needle and smoothed her skirt. Adelaide Porter, the saloon owner, one of the women who'd been coolly dismissive at church that first Sunday. This could be trouble or opportunity. Margaret had learned long ago that with women like Adelaide, it was often difficult to tell which until you were already committed. Adelaide was standing by the parlor window when Margaret entered, her bearing upright and her dress fashionable despite the frontier setting. She turned as Margaret came in, and her expression was difficult to read. "Mrs. Holloway," she said with a slight nod. "Mrs. Porter, this is unexpected." "I imagine it is." Adelaide studied her for a long moment. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened yesterday. About Sarah and the Gundersons." Margaret lifted her chin slightly. "I stand by what I did. I didn't come here to criticize you." Adelaide moved away from the window, her skirts rustling. "I came to tell you that I've had my own concerns about that household for some time. The Gundersons have fostered 4 children in the past 3 years. None of them stayed more than 6 months. There have been incidents." "What kind of incidents?" "A boy who showed up at school with burns on his hands. A girl who ran away twice and had to be brought back by the sheriff. Another child who stopped speaking entirely for nearly 2 months." Adelaide's mouth tightened. "But families who are willing to take in orphans are few. And Mr. Calhoun, well, he's more concerned with placing children and collecting his stipend than with ensuring their welfare." Margaret felt anger rising again, the same fierce protectiveness she'd felt in the town square. Someone needs to hold him accountable. That's easier said than done. Calhoun is married to the minister's sister. He has influential friends in the territorial government. And frankly, most people in this town don't want to look too closely at what happens to the orphans. Out of sight, out of mind, that's unconscionable. It's practical, Adelaide said, though her tone suggested she didn't necessarily approve. Resources are limited out here. People worry about their own families first. Orphans are children, Margaret interrupted quietly. They're children who deserve safety and care and someone to fight for them. Adelaide smiled slightly. Yes, they are, and that's why I'm here. You've made yourself conspicuous, Mrs. Holloway. You've drawn attention to an issue that many would prefer to ignore. That will make you unpopular in some quarters. I'm already unpopular, true, but this is different. Before, you were simply invisible. Now you've made yourself a problem. The question is, what do you intend to do about it? Margaret sat down in one of the parlor chairs, gesturing for Adelaide to do the same. I honestly don't know. I can't adopt Sarah myself. I'm unmarried, I have no property, barely any savings. Mr. Calhoun would never approve it. But I can't just stand by and watch her be mistreated. No, Adelaide said thoughtfully. I don't believe you can. It's not in your nature. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm a widow myself, as you probably know. My husband died 7 years ago, left me with the saloon and enough debts that I almost lost everything. I've had to fight for every inch of respect I have in this town. I've had to prove myself twice over because I'm a woman running a business that most people think should be run by men. You've succeeded admirably from what I can see. I've survived. There's a difference. Adelaide leaned forward slightly. What I'm trying to say is that I recognize a fighter when I see one. And I think perhaps this town needs someone willing to fight for those children. What are you suggesting? I'm not entirely sure yet, but I wanted you to know that you're not alone. If you decide to pursue this, if you decide to push back against Calhoun and the way things have always been done, you'll have at least one ally. Margaret felt something warm unfold in her chest. Thank you. That means more than you might think. Adelaide stood, preparing to leave. One more thing. I heard about that bread you brought to the social gathering. Ruth tells me you're an excellent cook and a skilled seamstress. I've had years of practice. The Silver Dollar needs someone to handle the cooking. My current cook is leaving next month to move back east. The pay isn't generous, but it's steady. You'd work 5 days a week, preparing meals for the lunch hour. It would give you an income while you figure out what to do next. Margaret stared at her. You're offering me work? I'm offering you a position. There's a difference. The job is yours if you want it, but I need someone reliable and skilled. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm making a business decision. I'll take it, Margaret said immediately. Thank you. After Adelaide left, Margaret sat in the parlor for a long time, holding the wooden spoon she'd brought with her from St. Louis. It had been her mother's originally, passed down when Margaret married, used in countless meals for Thomas and Emma. Carried west as one of the few possessions that connected her to her old life. The handle was smooth from years of use, the wood darkened with age. She thought about Adelaide's words. A fighter, someone willing to push back against the way things had always been done. Was that who she was? Or was that who she needed to become? That afternoon, she took a basket of food to the orphanage. Fresh bread, a jar of the apple preserve she'd made from Ruth's pantry supplies, some cookies she'd baked that morning. She knocked on the door of the long, low building and waited. Mr. Calhoun answered, a lean man in his 50s, with hard eyes and a perpetually disapproving expression. Mrs. Holloway, he said coldly. What do you want? I brought some food for the children, Margaret said pleasantly. I thought they might enjoy a treat. The children are adequately fed. I'm sure they are. This is just extra. A kindness. Calhoun's jaw tightened. I know what you're doing. Trying to ingratiate yourself. Trying to make yourself look like some kind of savior. But let me be clear, Mrs. Holloway. These children are my responsibility. What happens in my orphanage and in the homes where I place them is none of your concern. Children's welfare is everyone's concern, Margaret replied, keeping her voice even. And I'm not trying to interfere. I simply wanted to bring them something nice. The Gundersons have complained about your interference. They're considering returning Sarah to the orphanage because of the trouble you've caused. Margaret's heart clenched. Returning her would be the best thing that could happen to that child. Would it? And who will take her then? You, an unmarried woman with no property and no means. His smile was unpleasant. You can't save them, Mrs. Holloway. You can't even save yourself. So I suggest you stop trying to be something you're not and accept your own limitations. He took the basket from her hands and closed the door in her face. Margaret stood there for a long moment, trembling with anger and frustration. Then she heard a small sound, a window opening on the side of the building. She walked around and found 3 faces pressed against the bars, children looking down at her with curious, hopeful eyes. "Are you the lady who helped Sarah?" one of them whispered. "A boy of about 8. "Yes," Margaret said softly. "I'm Margaret." "Thank you," the boy said. "The Gundersons are mean." "I know, sweetheart." "I'm sorry. Will you help the rest of us too?" asked a girl, slightly older with light brown hair. Margaret looked up at those faces, children who'd lost their parents, who'd been passed around like unwanted parcels, who'd learned not to expect kindness. And she thought about Calhoun's words. You can't save them. Maybe he was right. Maybe she couldn't save them all. But maybe she could save one. And maybe one would lead to another and another. "I'll try," she promised. "I'll try my very best." The children smiled and the window closed again as footsteps approached from inside. Margaret walked back to the boarding house with her empty basket and a heart full of determination. That evening, Sarah appeared at the boarding house. Ruth called Margaret down to the parlor where the girl was waiting, fidgeting with the torn hem of her dress. "They're sending me back," Sarah said without preamble. "The Gundersons. They told Mr. Calhoun they can't manage me anymore." Margaret knelt down to Sarah's level. "When?" "Tomorrow. Mr. Calhoun is coming to get me in the morning. How do you feel about that?" Sarah shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The orphanage is better than the Gundersons, I guess. At least there I don't have to sleep in the barn." "Sarah, listen to me. I'm going to find a way to help you. I don't know how yet, but I promise you I'm not going to give up." "You can't adopt me," Sarah said bluntly. "Mr. Calhoun already said so. You're not married and you don't have a house. Not yet. But things can change. Not for people like me. I'm just an orphan. Nobody really wants orphans." Margaret took Sarah's face gently in her hands. "I want you, not because I need a worker or because I get paid to take you in. I want you because you're smart and brave and full of spirit, and because when I look at you, I see someone worth fighting for." Sarah's composure cracked. She threw her arms around Margaret's neck and sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that spoke of years of loss and loneliness and desperate hope, constantly disappointed. Margaret held her close, stroking her hair, murmuring comfort, and making silent promises to herself and to this child that she would find a way. When Sarah finally pulled back, wiping her eyes on her sleeve, Margaret produced her handkerchief, the same one she'd used to clean Sarah's knee at the social gathering. "Keep this," she said, "as a reminder that I meant what I said. I'm not giving up on you." Sarah clutched the handkerchief like a lifeline. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. You can call me Margaret, sweetheart." After Sarah left, Margaret sat with Ruth in the kitchen. "I need to find a way to help her," she said. I need to become someone who can adopt her. Someone with means and standing. That's not something that happens overnight," Ruth said gently. "I know. But I have to start somewhere." Margaret looked at her friend. "Adelaide offered me work at the Silver Dollar. I'm going to take it, and I'm going to save every penny. And I'm going to prove to this town, to Calhoun, to everyone, that age doesn't determine worth. That there's more than one way to build a life worth living." Ruth smiled. "Now that sounds like the Margaret I've been waiting to meet. The one who's been hiding under all that grief and uncertainty." "I haven't been hiding," Margaret protested. "Haven't you? You came here hoping someone would choose you, would see value in you, would give you permission to matter. But that's not how it works, dear. You have to choose yourself first. You have to decide you matter, regardless of what anyone else thinks." Margaret sat with those words long after Ruth had gone to bed. In her room, she took out the wooden spoon again, holding it in her hands. She thought about all the meals she'd made with it, all the nourishment she'd provided, all the love she'd poured into the simple act of feeding her family. She'd thought her time for that was over. She'd thought her purpose had died with Thomas and Emma. But maybe purpose wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you created, day by day, choice by choice, one act of courage at a time. The next morning, she started work at the Silver Dollar. Working at the Silver Dollar gave Margaret more than just an income. It gave her a window into the heart of Cedar Falls. The saloon wasn't simply a place for drinking, though that happened in the evenings. During the day, it served as an informal gathering place where business deals were negotiated. News was exchanged, and the pulse of the community could be felt most clearly. Margaret's domain was the kitchen, a surprisingly well-equipped space at the back of the building. Adelaide ran a tight operation, expecting quality and efficiency. Margaret provided both. She'd arrived each morning at 6 o'clock to prepare the lunch offerings, hearty stews, fresh bread, meat pies, and simple but well-made desserts that reminded the men of home cooking without being too fancy for their tastes. By the end of her first week, she had a reputation. Men who'd never looked at her twice began nodding respectfully as she walked to work. "That's fine cooking, Mrs. Holloway," they'd say. "Or best pot roast I've had since leaving Indiana." Small acknowledgements, but they mattered. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Margaret felt useful. The work also gave her access to information. Adelaide would often come into the kitchen to discuss the day's menu, and their conversations would naturally drift to other topics, town politics, business developments, and inevitably, the children at the orphanage. 3 more children arrived this week, Adelaide mentioned one morning, leaning against the kitchen doorframe while Margaret kneaded bread dough. The siblings. Their parents died in a wagon accident on the trail into town. Margaret's hands stilled. "How old?" "Young, 5, 7, and 9. The 9-year-old is a girl named Emily. She's trying to keep her brothers together, poor thing. But you know how it is. Calhoun will likely separate them. Families usually want 1 child, not 3. "That's cruel," Margaret said quietly. "They've just lost their parents. They need each other now more than ever." "I don't disagree. But reality is reality." Adelaide paused. "Sarah's back at the orphanage permanently now. The Gundersons washed their hands of her. I know. I've seen her twice this week." Margaret had begun visiting the orphanage regularly, despite Calhoun's obvious disapproval. She couldn't bring Sarah out, couldn't take her anywhere officially, but she could sit with her in the orphanage's sparse common room and read to her. She'd brought the leather-bound book of poetry she'd kept from her old life, and she and Sarah would spend Sunday afternoons lost in verses that spoke of beauty and hope, and worlds beyond the harsh realities they knew. "You're getting attached," Adelaide observed. "I've been attached since the day I met her. That's going to make this harder, you know. When she eventually gets placed with another family, she won't." Margaret shaped the dough with practiced hands, not looking up. "I'm going to adopt her myself." Adelaide was silent for a moment. "Margaret, I admire your determination, but you know the obstacles. You're unmarried. You rent a room at a boarding house. Your income is modest. For now. But circumstances change." Margaret finally looked up, meeting Adelaide's gaze. "I've been thinking about this carefully. I need property. That's the main requirement, isn't it? Property and sufficient income to provide for a child, along with being married usually. But not always. Calhoun's main concern is that children be provided for, not become burdens on the territorial government. If I can demonstrate financial stability and a proper home, he'll have less ground to refuse me. Even if that's true, property doesn't come cheap, I'm aware. That's why I'm saving everything I can." Margaret had been keeping meticulous records in a small ledger she'd purchased from the general store. Every cent she earned, every penny she spent. She'd calculated how long it would take to save enough for a deposit on land, how much she'd need for materials to build or repair a structure, how much buffer she'd need to prove ongoing income. The numbers were daunting. At her current rate of saving, it would take years. Years that Sarah didn't have. Years during which the girl would continue to be passed from one unsuitable home to another, her spirit slowly crushed by rejection and neglect. But Margaret was nothing if not resourceful. She'd begun taking on additional work in her spare time, mending clothes for other women in town, baking bread and cakes for special occasions, offering her knowledge of herbal remedies to people who couldn't afford the doctor. Every small job added to her savings, and more importantly, it added to her reputation as someone capable and reliable. On Sunday afternoons, when she visited the orphanage, other children began joining her and Sarah for story time. Margaret would read aloud from the poetry book, explaining the difficult words, discussing what the poems might mean, encouraging the children to share their own thoughts and feelings. Emily, the new girl, whose parents had died in the wagon accident, was particularly drawn to the sessions. She'd sit close to Margaret's side, her two younger brothers flanking her protectively. The girl had a serious, watchful quality that reminded Margaret of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for her years. "This one's my favorite," Sarah said one afternoon, pointing to a poem about birds taking flight. "It makes me feel like maybe someday I'll be free too." "You will be," Margaret assured her. "You're already freer than you think. Your mind, your spirit, those belong to you alone. No one can take those away." "Mr. Calhoun tries," Emily said quietly. "He says we should be grateful and obedient." "That thinking too much is prideful." Margaret felt anger flare, but kept her voice calm. "Mr. Calhoun is wrong. Thinking is how we understand the world. Questions are how we learn. Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of using the mind God gave you." After the reading session, as Margaret was preparing to leave, Sarah walked her to the door. "I've been saving something for you," the girl said shyly. She pulled a small package from her pocket, wrapped in newspaper. Margaret unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a handkerchief. Not fine linen, like the one Margaret had given Sarah, but rough cotton that had clearly been scavenged from somewhere. Sarah had embroidered flowers on it in careful, uneven stitches. The flowers were clumsy, the thread colors mismatched, but the love and effort that had gone into each stitch was unmistakable. "Oh, Sarah," Margaret breathed, her throat tightening with emotion. "This is beautiful." "It's not very good," Sarah said, suddenly uncertain. "I'm not good at sewing like you probably are. But I wanted you to have something from me. Like I have something from you." Margaret knelt down and pulled the girl into a fierce embrace. "It's perfect. It's the most precious thing anyone has given me in years." "Thank you, sweetheart." She carried that handkerchief with her everywhere after that, tucked in her pocket next to her own. When her resolve wavered, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, she would touch it and remember what she was fighting for. The weeks passed, and Margaret fell into a rhythm. Work at the Silver Dollar 5 mornings a week. Afternoons spent on additional work, sewing, baking, helping Ruth with the boarding house tasks in exchange for reduced rent. Sunday visits to the orphanage. And always, the careful accounting of every penny saved. She also began attending the town council meetings, sitting quietly in the back of the room where citizens were allowed to observe. At first, people looked at her with curiosity or mild disapproval. What was a woman doing there, taking interest in civic matters? But Margaret ignored the looks and listened carefully to the discussions about town business, territorial regulations, property laws, and budget allocations. She learned that the orphanage received a fixed stipend per child from the territorial government, and that Mr. Calhoun was supposed to provide detailed accounting of how those funds were spent. She learned that families who took in foster children received a small monthly payment to help with expenses. She learned that adoption procedures required approval from Calhoun as the orphanage director, a character assessment from at least 2 respected community members, and proof of adequate resources to provide for a child. She also learned, through careful attention to the discussions about property and land claims, that there was a parcel of land on the outskirts of town that had reverted to the territorial government after the previous owners had abandoned it. The land wasn't large, maybe 10 acres, but it had a small structure on it, a cabin that needed work but was fundamentally sound. The territory was looking to sell it for back taxes owed. Margaret began making inquiries. How much were the back taxes? What was the minimum bid required? When would the sale take place? She learned that she had 3 months until the auction, and that the likely cost would be more than she could save in that time. But she also learned something else. At one of the council meetings, Sheriff Brennan mentioned a territorial program designed to encourage settlement by single women, widows, spinsters, women alone who were willing to work the land and contribute to the community. Under this program, the territory would provide favorable terms for land purchases to qualified women, including extended payment plans and reduced interest rates. After the meeting, Margaret approached the sheriff. "Excuse me, Sheriff Brennan, that program you mentioned, for single women acquiring land. Could you tell me more about it?" He looked at her with interest. "You thinking about putting in an application, Mrs. Holloway?" "I'm considering it. Well, the requirements are pretty straightforward. You have to demonstrate some means of income, enough to make the payments and provide for yourself. You have to get recommendations from at least 3 established residents vouching for your character. And you have to prove you're serious about staying, about being part of the community. I see. And where would I find the application forms?" "I have some at my office. But Mrs. Holloway, I'll be honest with you, it's not common for women your age to be approved. The program is really designed for younger widows, women who have more years ahead of them to work the land." There it was again. Her age, the constant barrier. Margaret drew herself up and met his eyes steadily. "With respect, Sheriff, I have plenty of years ahead of me, and I have skills and experience that younger women might not. I can manage a household efficiently. I know how to make the most of limited resources, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Age isn't always a liability." Sheriff Brennan studied her for a moment, then smiled slightly. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose it is. Come by my office tomorrow and I'll give you those forms." That night, Margaret could barely sleep. A real possibility was opening before her. Not a certain path, but a genuine opportunity. If she could secure that land, if she could build a stable home and demonstrate financial reliability, then perhaps, just perhaps, she could make a case for adopting Sarah. She got the application forms the next day and filled them out carefully, detailing her work history, her current employment, her skills and her savings. For references, she listed Ruth McAllister, Adelaide Porter, and, after some hesitation, Sheriff Tom Brennan himself, who had told her she could use his name. The application process would take time. There would be interviews, assessments, reviews, but it was a start. It was hope made tangible. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to wait at the orphanage, and Margaret continued her Sunday visits. The bond between them grew stronger with each meeting. They had developed their own small rituals. Margaret would bring a treat she'd baked, Sarah would share what she'd been learning at school, and they would read poetry together, discussing the meanings and dreaming together about a future that might be different from the present. "If you had a house," Sarah asked one Sunday, "what would it be like?" Margaret considered the question. "It would be small but comfortable. A kitchen with a good stove for cooking and baking, a parlor with lots of books on shelves, windows that let in plenty of light, a garden where we could grow vegetables and flowers." And she paused, looking at Sarah. Enough bedrooms for the people who lived there to each have their own space. A place where they could be themselves. "That sounds nice," Sarah said wistfully. "I've never had my own room. At the orphanage we sleep 6 to a room, and at the Gundersons I slept in the barn. Someday," Margaret said firmly, "you'll have your own room, with your own bed and your own things. A place that's truly yours. Do you really believe that?" "I do. I'm working toward it right now." Sarah's eyes widened. "You are?" Margaret hesitated, not wanting to raise hopes that might be disappointed, but also wanting to be honest. "I've applied for a program that might help me acquire some land. If I'm approved, I'll be able to build a proper home. And then, well, then I'll be in a much better position to apply to adopt you." Sarah stared at her, tears welling in her eyes. "You really want to adopt me? You're not just saying that? I really want to adopt you, more than I can properly express. You've brought purpose back into my life, Sarah. You've reminded me what it means to love and to fight for something that matters." Sarah threw her arms around Margaret's neck, holding on tightly. "I want to be your daughter," she whispered. "I want it more than anything." "Then we'll make it happen," Margaret promised. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But we'll make it happen." As Margaret walked back to the boarding house that evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. Yes, there were still enormous obstacles ahead. Yes, the approval for the land program was uncertain. Yes, even if she got the land, Calhoun might still refuse the adoption. But for the first time since Thomas and Emma died, she had a clear purpose, a specific goal, and someone to fight for besides herself. She touched the handkerchief in her pocket, the one Sarah had made for her with such care, and felt the determination solidify into something like faith. Not faith that everything would work out easily, but faith that the fight itself was worthwhile. That love was worth pursuing even when the odds seemed impossible. That evening she started a new project. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, and now seemed like the right time to begin. Using fabric scraps that Adelaide had given her from old curtains and worn-out dresses, Margaret began piecing together a quilt. Each square would represent something, a hope, a memory, a promise. She'd work on it in the evenings after her other tasks were done, creating something beautiful from fragments, something whole from pieces. It seemed appropriate somehow. That's what she was trying to do with her life after all. Take the broken pieces, her grief, her age, her losses, and stitch them together into something new, something with purpose and meaning and love. Winter was coming to Cedar Falls. Margaret could feel it in the morning air, see it in the way the light slanted lower across the horizon each day. The prairie grass had turned gold and brittle, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were losing their leaves in drifts of yellow. The change of season brought urgency. Margaret's application for the land program was still being reviewed, a process that seemed to move at a glacial pace, despite Sheriff Brennan's assurances that these things took time. Meanwhile, her savings were growing, slowly but steadily. Each week, she added a few more dollars to the small metal box she kept hidden under her bed, wrapped in one of her shawls. But time was not neutral. While Margaret worked toward her goal, Sarah remained at the orphanage, vulnerable to being placed with another family at any moment. And the other children, Emily and her brothers, the older boys, the younger girls, they all continued to exist in that liminal space between past loss and uncertain future. One November morning, as Margaret was preparing lunch at the Silver Dollar, Adelaide came into the kitchen with news. "The Hayes siblings are being split up," she said without preamble. "Emily's going to the Whitakers' farm. The two boys are going to separate families." Margaret's knife stilled over the onion she'd been chopping. "No, they've already lost their parents. They need each other." "I know. But Mr. Whitaker only wants a girl to help his wife with the housework. And the Drummonds will take the middle boy to work in their dry goods store. The youngest is going to the Ashfords." "That's cruel," Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. "Those children should stay together." "Should, yes. But we don't live in a world of should, Margaret. We live in the world as it is." Adelaide paused. "Emily's taking it hard. She keeps asking if there's any way—" "There isn't," Margaret interrupted, then immediately regretted her sharp tone. She set down the knife and pressed her palms against the counter. "I'm sorry. I feel so helpless. You're doing what you can. More than most. It's not enough." That Sunday, when Margaret arrived at the orphanage for her usual visit, Emily was waiting by the door, her face pale and set with determination. "Mrs. Holloway," the girl said urgently, "I need to talk to you." They walked a short distance from the building, Emily glancing back nervously to make sure they weren't overheard. "They're separating us," she said, her voice cracking. "They're taking my brothers away. I promised my mother. When she was dying, I promised I'd keep us together. And now I'm breaking that promise." Margaret knelt down, ignoring the cold ground seeping through her skirt. "Emily, sweetheart, this isn't your fault. You're 9 years old. The responsibility for keeping your family together doesn't rest on your shoulders. But I'm the oldest. I'm supposed to take care of them. You have been taking care of them. You've been brave and strong and so good to them. But some things are beyond your control, and that doesn't make you a failure. Tears streamed down Emily's face. "I don't want to go to the Whitakers. I don't want to leave my brothers. Can't you—" She stopped, seeming to realize the impossibility of what she was about to ask. "Can't I what?" Margaret prompted gently. "Can't you take us? All three of us? I know you want Sarah, and I know you don't have much money, but we wouldn't be trouble. We'd work hard. We'd help with everything. Please, Mrs. Holloway, please don't let them separate us." Margaret's heart broke. She pulled Emily into her arms, holding the sobbing child, while her own tears fell silently. "Oh, sweetheart, I wish I could. If I had the means, if I had a home. But I don't, not yet. I'm barely able to think about taking in one child, let alone three. So you're saying no. I'm saying I can't, not now. But—" Margaret pulled back, looking into Emily's eyes. "I promise you this. I will not forget about you and your brothers. I will keep track of where you are, and if you're not being treated well, I will do something about it. And when I do get a home of my own, when I have the means to help more children, you and your brothers will be first on my list. That's a promise." It was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. But she made it anyway, because Emily needed hope the way she needed air. And sometimes hope was all you could offer. Later that afternoon, when she was reading poetry with Sarah, Margaret found it hard to concentrate. Her mind kept returning to Emily's plea, to the look of desperation in that child's eyes. How many more children would she have to watch suffer while she slowly, painstakingly built the foundation for a life that could help them? "Oh, you're sad today," Sarah observed. "Is it because of Emily?" "Yes, and because I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said something remarkably wise for a 10-year-old. "My father used to say that you can't carry all the world's troubles on your back. You do what you can with what you have, and you trust that it matters, even when you can't see how." Margaret looked at this child, this brave, bright, resilient child, and felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. "Your father was a smart man." "He was. I miss him every day. I miss my daughter every day, too. Emma, she'd be about your age if she'd lived. Do you think that's why—" Sarah hesitated. "Do you think that's why you care about me? Because I remind you of her?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "At first, maybe partly. You reminded me of what it felt like to love a child, to want to protect someone. But Sarah, you're not a replacement for Emma. You're yourself, unique and irreplaceable. I care about you because of who you are, not because of who you remind me of." Sarah smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "Good, because I want to be your daughter, not someone else's shadow. You could never be anyone's shadow. You're too bright for that." As winter settled in more firmly, Margaret's routine continued, but with added challenges. The walk to the Silver Dollar in the morning cold became more difficult. Her room at the boarding house, adequate in warmer months, grew chilly as the temperature dropped. She spent more on heating and warmer clothes, which slowed her saving, but there was also progress. In mid-November, Sheriff Brennan called her to his office. "Your application has been approved," he said, handing her an official-looking document. "Pending final review, you've been accepted into the territorial program for land acquisition. The parcel we discussed, the 10 acres with the cabin, it's yours if you want it. You'll need to make a down payment of $30, then monthly payments of $5 for the next 2 years. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the document. $30. She had 42 saved. That would leave her with only $12 for materials, repairs, furniture, and all the other expenses that would come with claiming the land and making it livable. "I know it's not much left over," Sheriff Brennan said, reading her expression. "And winter's not the best time to take on property. The cabin needs work, new roof in places, windows need repair, the well needs to be checked. You'd be taking on a lot. When do I need to decide?" "You've got until the end of the month. The territory wants an answer by then, so they can offer it to someone else. If you decline—" Margaret walked back to the boarding house in a daze. This was it, the opportunity she'd been working toward. But the timing was terrible, the resources insufficient, the challenges enormous. She was 43 years old, heading into winter, about to take on a property that needed extensive repairs, with barely enough money left over to see her through. Was she crazy to even consider it? That evening, she took out the silver locket she'd worn every day since Thomas died. It had been his gift to her on their 10th anniversary. Inside, there had once been tiny portraits of Thomas and Emma, carefully painted miniatures. But the portraits had been lost in her various moves. And now the locket was empty, a beautiful shell with no contents. Waiting to be filled again, she held it in her palm, feeling its weight, thinking about what it represented. The past, yes, but also the future. An empty space waiting for new love, new family, new purpose. Ruth found her there, sitting by the window in her room. "You're thinking about the land," Ruth said. "It wasn't a question. I don't know if I'm brave enough," Margaret admitted. "Or foolish enough. I'm not sure which it would be." Ruth sat down beside her. "When I was younger than you are now, my husband died and left me with nothing but debts and this boarding house that was falling apart. Everyone told me to sell it, move in with my sister, except that my life as an independent woman was over. But I looked at this building and I thought, this could be something. With work and time and determination, this could be a home. Not just for me, but for other women who needed a place. So I took the risk. Borrowed money. Fixed it up bit by bit. And here we are 20 years later. You're saying I should do it. I'm saying that risk and bravery are often the same thing. And that the life you're building, for yourself and for Sarah, it's worth fighting for." Margaret thought about Sarah waiting at the orphanage, about Emily and her brothers being separated, about all the other children who needed someone to fight for them. And she thought about herself, a woman who'd been told she was too old, too worn, too late. "I'm going to do it," she said suddenly. "I'm going to claim that land." Ruth smiled. "I thought you might." The next morning, Margaret went to Sheriff Brennan's office and signed the papers. She paid her $30 deposit, watching more than 2 months of careful saving disappear in an instant. She received the deed to the property and the key to the cabin, and she felt terror and exhilaration in equal measure. "Congratulations," Sheriff Brennan said. "You're now a landowner, a landowner." The words felt strange and wonderful. For the first time in 5 years, Margaret owned something of substance. She had roots again, even if they were still shallow and uncertain. That afternoon, she walked out to see her property. It was about a mile east of town, accessible by a rough trail that would be muddy in spring and hard-packed in summer. The 10 acres stretched out in a gentle roll, covered in prairie grass and brush. At the center sat the cabin, small and weathered, with gaps in the chinking between logs and a roof that sagged ominously on one corner, but it had 4 walls and a door and windows with actual glass, even if some panes were cracked. It had a fireplace and a wooden floor and enough space for, Margaret counted carefully, a main room, a smaller sleeping room, and a lean-to addition that could be made into another sleeping space. It was far from perfect, but it was hers. She stood there as the sun lowered toward the horizon, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and felt something shift in her chest. This land, this broken-down cabin, this was hope made tangible. This was the foundation on which she could build a life that mattered. And somewhere in town, in the orphanage, Sarah was waiting for the promise Margaret had made to become reality. "I'm coming," Margaret whispered to the wind. "I'm building something, and I'm coming for you." News of Margaret's land acquisition spread through Cedar Falls within days. Reactions were mixed. Some people thought she'd overreached, that a woman her age had no business taking on such a project alone. Others were quietly impressed by her determination. A few saw opportunity, not for Margaret's benefit, but for their own. Jacob Mills, the widower who'd once offered Margaret a practical marriage arrangement, stopped by the boarding house with a proposition. "I heard about your land," he said, hat in hand. "That's quite an undertaking for a woman alone." "I was thinking, my offer from before still stands. We could combine our resources. I've got farming equipment and labor. You've got land now. Together we could make something of it." Margaret studied him carefully. "And Sarah, the orphan girl I want to adopt?" Jacob shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I suppose we could talk about that, if the arrangement worked out. Though adding another mouth to feed along with my 3 boys, it would be a lot. I appreciate the offer." "Mr. Mills," but I'm managing on my own. Margaret, he said, and his use of her first name felt presumptuous. Be realistic. Winter's coming. You've got a broken-down cabin and barely any money left. You're going to need help, then I'll find it elsewhere. Good day, Mr. Mills. After he left, Ruth came into the parlor. That took courage, she said. Turning down security when you're facing such uncertainty. It wasn't really security he was offering, Margaret replied. It was another form of servitude, wrapped in practical terms. But Mills's words stayed with her. He wasn't entirely wrong about her situation. She had land, yes, but she also had an enormous amount of work ahead and limited resources to accomplish it. She needed help, not in the form of a marriage of convenience, but in the form of genuine community support. She began with Adelaide. I'd need to make the cabin habitable before the worst of winter hits, Margaret explained over coffee at the Silver Dollar. I can't afford to hire skilled labor, but I can offer payment in kind. Cooking, sewing, preserving food for families who help. Do you think anyone would be interested? Adelaide considered. Some might be. But Margaret, you're asking people to invest time and effort in helping a woman who many still see as an outsider. You'll need to offer them a reason beyond simple payment. What kind of reason? A vision. Show them what you're building and why it matters. Make them see that helping you isn't just about fixing up a cabin, it's about building something that benefits the whole community. So Margaret began talking to people. She spoke to the women at church about her plans to create not just a home for herself and Sarah, but a place where other orphans might visit, where women could gather, where community could be built. She talked to the school teacher, Ellen Whitmore, about her dream of teaching children to read and think and ask questions. Ellen, who'd been quietly supportive from the beginning, surprised Margaret with an offer. I'm 38 years old, Ellen said, unmarried and unlikely to marry at this point. I live in a small room behind the schoolhouse, and I've been thinking about finding better quarters. What if I moved into your cabin? I could help with repairs, contribute to expenses, and we could support each other. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. You'd really do that? I'd really do that. I've been watching what you're doing, Margaret. How you're fighting for those children, refusing to accept the limitations others want to place on you. It's inspired me to think differently about my own life. Maybe there's more than one way to build a family and a home. With Ellen as a partner in the endeavor, Margaret's project suddenly seemed more achievable. Word spread that two single women, older women, women who'd been dismissed as past their usefulness, were building something together. Some people laughed. Others were intrigued. Sheriff Brennan quietly passed the word that he'd help with the heavy repairs on weekends. My wife thinks what you're doing is admirable, he said. And I tend to agree. Adelaide donated materials from the saloon, old curtains that could be remade, dishes that had been replaced with newer ones. A sturdy table that was taking up storage space. Ruth contributed blankets, cooking equipment, and her own labor on Sundays. Even some of the men who'd been skeptical began to offer help. Not from charity, but from a kind of grudging respect for someone who was at least trying to make something of herself, rather than simply accepting defeat. By early December, the cabin was transforming. The roof was patched and sealed. The windows were repaired and now had actual shutters for the cold nights. The fireplace was cleaned and reinforced. The chinking between logs was redone to keep out the wind. The main room had been cleaned and whitewashed, making it feel larger and brighter. Margaret and Ellen moved in just before the first serious snowfall. The cabin was far from comfortable. It was cold at night despite the fire, drafty in corners and sparse in furnishings. But it was theirs. They had a home. Sarah visited for the first time on a Sunday afternoon, brought by Ruth, who'd gotten permission from Mr. Calhoun for the outing. The girl walked through the small space with wide eyes, touching the table, running her hand along the wall, staring at the sleeping room that Margaret had prepared with a small bed and a chest for storage. "This is yours," Sarah asked wonderingly. "This is ours," Margaret corrected gently. "Yours and mine, as soon as I can make it official." "When will that be?" "I don't know yet. I need to prove to Mr. Calhoun that I can provide for you properly." That will take time, showing that I have steady income, that the home is stable, that I can meet all your needs." Sarah's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I can wait. I've waited this long." That evening, after Sarah had returned to the orphanage, Margaret and Ellen sat by the fire, working on the quilt together. It had grown significantly. Margaret had been adding squares steadily, and now Ellen contributed her own pieces, squares that represented her own hopes and dreams. "I've been thinking," Ellen said as she stitched, "about Emily and her brothers, about all the children who need homes. What if, and I know this is ambitious, what if this place could eventually be more than just a home for Sarah? What if it could be a proper foster home, officially recognized, where siblings could stay together?" Margaret looked at her friend. "That would require even more resources. More space, more income, official approval, I know. But think about it. Between your cooking skills and my teaching income, we'd have a steady foundation. If we could expand the cabin, maybe add another room or two, we could house several children. We could keep families together instead of splitting them apart." It was an audacious vision, perhaps too audacious. But Margaret found herself considering it seriously. It would take years to build to that point. Years of proving ourselves, saving money, gaining trust. "Most worthwhile things take years," Ellen pointed out. "And we're not exactly short on time, despite what people think about our ages." Margaret smiled at that. "No, I suppose we're not." As Christmas approached, Cedar Falls began its preparations for the holiday. The town always came together for a Christmas Eve celebration at the church, followed by gift exchanges and communal meals. This year, Margaret had an idea. "The orphanage children never get much for Christmas," she said to Adelaide. "Maybe a small gift each from Mr. Calhoun, but nothing special, nothing personal. What if we organized a proper Christmas for them?" Adelaide raised an eyebrow. "We? The women of Cedar Falls? We could make gifts, knitted scarves, mittens, dolls for the girls, wooden toys for the boys. We could prepare a special meal. We could show those children that they matter, that they're seen." "Calhoun won't like it. He'll see it as interference. Then let him. Those children deserve one day where they feel valued and loved." Adelaide studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "You know what? I'm in, and I'll help you recruit others." The project began modestly, but grew as word spread. Women who'd been indifferent to Margaret before found themselves drawn into the effort. There was something about preparing gifts for children that softened hearts, that reminded people of what truly mattered. They met at Margaret's cabin on Sunday afternoons, a dozen women crowding into the small space, bringing fabric scraps and yarn and wood and tools. They worked and talked and laughed, building community through their shared purpose. Ruth knitted scarves in bright colors. Adelaide sewed dolls with careful stitching and embroidered faces. Ellen carved simple wooden animals. Margaret made patchwork quilts, small ones, lap-sized, that could be owned by individual children. As they worked, they talked about their own lives, their own struggles and hopes. Mrs. Brennan, the sheriff's wife, spoke about her daughter who died in infancy. Mrs. Porter, Adelaide, talked about the loneliness of widowhood and the challenges of running a business as a woman. Ellen shared her frustrations with the limitations placed on female teachers, how she was paid half what a male teacher would earn, slowly, without quite meaning to. These women were building something that went beyond preparing Christmas gifts. They were building a network of support, a community of women who understood what it meant to fight against expectations and limitations. On Christmas Eve, they arrived at the orphanage with baskets full of wrapped gifts and food. Mr. Calhoun tried to turn them away at first. "This is highly irregular," he said, blocking the door. "The children have their routine. I don't want them getting ideas above their station." "It's Christmas," Margaret said firmly, "and these children deserve joy as much as anyone. You can either let us in, or you can explain to your wife and her brother, the minister, why you denied children Christmas gifts." Calhoun's face reddened, but he stepped aside. The next 2 hours were magical. The children's faces lit up as they received gifts, real gifts chosen thoughtfully, made with care. Sarah clutched her new quilt to her chest, running her fingers over the patches that Margaret had carefully sewn. Emily held her doll as if it were made of gold. The boys examined their wooden toys with reverence and delight. They shared a meal together, roasted chicken that Adelaide had provided, vegetables that Ruth had preserved, bread that Margaret had baked, and pies that several women had contributed. The children ate until they were full, perhaps for the first time in memory, and they sang carols together, the women's voices blending with the children's, filling the cold orphanage with warmth and light and the sound of community. As they prepared to leave that evening, Emily pulled Margaret aside. "Thank you," she whispered. "For this, for not forgetting us. I'll never forget you," Margaret promised. "Any of you." Walking back to the cabin that night, Ellen linked her arm through Margaret's. "We did something good today. We did. But it's not enough. One day of joy doesn't undo the other 364 days of neglect." "No," Ellen agreed. "But it's a beginning. It shows what's possible. And sometimes that's enough to start changing things." That night, lying in her bed in the cabin she now owned, Margaret thought about the past 6 months. She'd arrived in Cedar Falls alone, dismissed, invisible. She'd had nothing but grief and a small amount of savings, and an uncertain hope for some kind of future. Now she had land. She had a home, rough as it was. She had work that mattered. She had friends, real friends, women who supported her vision. She had a purpose that went beyond simple survival, and she had Sarah, waiting for her to make good on promises that once seemed impossible, but now felt almost within reach. The silver locket lay on the small table beside her bed, catching moonlight through the window. Still empty, but not for much longer. Soon, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but soon, she would have something to put inside it. A new family, a new love, a new purpose. The old life was gone, lost to fever and death and grief. But a new life was being built, piece by piece, day by day, through courage and determination and the kind of love that refused to accept limitations. January brought bitter cold and a letter that would change everything. Margaret had been living in the cabin for nearly 2 months, and the routines of her new life had settled into comfortable patterns. She still worked at the Silver Dollar 5 mornings a week, though Adelaide had been flexible about letting her work from home when the weather was particularly harsh. Ellen taught at the schoolhouse during the day and returned in the evenings, and together they managed the challenges of frontier living with increasing competence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by the stagecoach driver who'd been asked to hand it directly to Mrs. Margaret Holloway of Cedar Falls. Ruth brought it to the cabin that evening, her expression curious. "This came for you," she said. "From Ohio, official-looking envelope." Margaret took it with trembling hands. She hadn't had contact with anyone in Ohio for years, not since leaving her sister's home. The envelope was indeed official. Thick paper, formal script, legal stamps. She opened it carefully, unfolding the papers inside. As she read, the room seemed to tilt around her. "Margaret," Ellen said with concern. "What is it?" "You've gone pale." "It's from a law office in Cleveland," Margaret said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "My great-aunt Josephine has died. I didn't even know she was still alive. I met her only once when I was very young. She was my grandmother's sister, quite elderly even then." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ruth said, "but there's more." Margaret looked up, her eyes wide with shock. "She's left me her property. A small homestead outside Cleveland, 40 acres with a house and outbuildings." And her voice caught, $500 in savings. The silence in the cabin was absolute. $500. It was a fortune by frontier standards, more money than Margaret had seen in her entire life, more money than she dared dream of having. "Dear God," Ellen breathed. "Margaret, do you know what this means?" Margaret sank into a chair, still holding the letter. "It means I could sell the Ohio property. The lawyer says there are interested buyers already. The land is worth at least another $300, possibly more. That's $800 total, maybe more. I could—" She stopped, her mind racing through possibilities so quickly she could barely hold on to them. "You could expand this cabin," Ruth said. "Make it large enough for several children. You could stop working so you had more time for mothering. You could—" I could leave Cedar Falls entirely, Margaret interrupted, and the other two women stared at her. I could take the money and go back east, find a city where no one knows me, buy a house, live comfortably. I wouldn't have to fight so hard for every inch of progress. The words hung in the air. It was true. She could leave. She could escape the struggle, the judgment, the constant battle to prove herself worthy. She could take the money and start over somewhere easier. Somewhere she wouldn't be constantly reminded of her age and her limitations. But Sarah, Ellen began. Sarah would understand, Margaret said. Though even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Sarah wouldn't understand. Sarah would see it as one more abandonment in a long line of abandonments. But perhaps that would be better in the long run. Better than raising the girl's hopes only to disappoint her. After Ruth and Ellen left, both clearly shaken by the news, Margaret sat alone by the fire, the letter in her lap. The wind howled outside, finding gaps in the cabin's defenses, making the flames dance. $800, maybe more. Enough to change everything. Enough to buy comfort and security. Enough to stop fighting. She thought about the past 6 months. The exhaustion, the constant struggle, the weight of trying to build something from nothing while the whole town watched skeptically. Wouldn't it be easier to just give up? To take the gift fate had offered and use it to build an easier life? She imagined herself in Cleveland or Cincinnati, a proper house with finished floors and glass in all the windows, a garden already established, neighbors who didn't know about her failed hopes for marriage or her age, a fresh start where she could be anyone. But then she thought about Sarah's face when she'd seen the cabin for the first time, the wonder in her eyes, the hope. And she thought about Emily and her brothers, separated and suffering. She thought about all the orphans who'd received those Christmas gifts, whose faces had lit up with joy at being seen, being valued, mattering to someone. She thought about the women who'd gathered to make those gifts, who'd found in that shared purpose something meaningful, who'd built connections and friendships around the work of caring for forgotten children. If she left, what would happen to them? Who would fight for those children? Who would push back against Calhoun's indifference and the town's willingness to look away? Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire until dawn, turning the question over and over in her mind. Security or purpose? Comfort or meaning? An easy life or a hard fight for something that mattered? When Ellen came down from the sleeping loft in the morning, she found Margaret still sitting there. The fire burned down to embers. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Ellen said quietly. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Part of me wants to. Part of me is so tired of struggling. I understand that. More than you might think." Ellen sat down beside her. "When I first came west to teach, I thought I was running toward something. Adventure, independence, purpose. But really, I was running away from being a spinster in a town where everyone pitied me. I wanted to be somewhere no one knew I'd been jilted, that no one wanted me. Out here I could pretend I'd chosen this life instead of having it chosen for me. What changed?" "Watching you," Ellen said simply. "Watching you refuse to accept what everyone else said you were. Watching you fight for something that mattered. It made me realize I'd been hiding, not living. And that maybe there was more than one way to build a meaningful life." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If I stay, if I use this money to build something here, there's no guarantee it will work. Calhoun might still refuse to let me adopt Sarah. The town might still see me as an outsider who doesn't belong. I could pour everything into this and still fail." "That's true," Ellen agreed. "But if you leave, you'll definitely fail. Because you'll have given up without knowing what might have been possible." The words settled in Margaret's chest, like seeds taking root. That afternoon, Sarah appeared at the cabin door, out of breath and wild-eyed. She'd run all the way from town, and there were tears streaming down her face. "You're leaving," she gasped. "I heard Mrs. McAllister telling someone at the general store. You inherited money and you're leaving Cedar Falls." Margaret's heart clenched. "Sarah, I knew it," the girl sobbed. "I knew it was too good to be true. Everyone leaves. Everyone gives up on me. Why did I think you'd be different?" "Come here," Margaret said, pulling the girl inside and closing the door against the cold. "Sit down." Let me explain, but Sarah wouldn't sit. She stood there trembling with cold and emotion, her face flushed and wet with tears. There's nothing to explain. You got money, and now you can have a better life somewhere else. Why would you stay here? Why would you stay for someone like me? Because, Margaret said, and suddenly the answer was crystal clear. You're the reason I'm here in the first place. Sarah stared at her. Margaret knelt down, taking the girl's cold hands in her own. When I came to Cedar Falls, I was lost. I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to offer. I was looking for someone to give me purpose, to tell me I still mattered. But then I met you, and you showed me that purpose isn't something someone gives you. It's something you choose, something you fight for. But the money changes things, yes. It gives me options I didn't have before. I could leave. I could go somewhere easier. But Sarah, I don't want easy. I want meaningful. I want to build something here that matters. And most of all, I want to be your mother. Not someday, not eventually, but now. As soon as legally possible. Sarah's tears came harder, but now they were different tears. You're staying? I'm staying. I'm using that money to expand this cabin, to make it big enough to house you properly, and maybe other children too. I'm using it to prove to Calhoun and everyone else that I can provide for you the way you deserve. I'm staying and I'm fighting and I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on us. Sarah threw herself into Margaret's arms, holding on with desperate strength. I love you, the girl whispered. I love you so much. I love you too, sweetheart. You're already my daughter in every way that matters. Now we just need to make it official. That evening, Margaret wrote 2 letters. The first was to the lawyer in Ohio, instructing him to sell the property for the best price he could get and send her the proceeds. The second was to Mr. Calhoun, informing him that she would be formally applying to adopt Sarah Brennan within the month, and that she now had the financial means to provide properly for a child. She knew Calhoun would resist. He didn't like her, didn't approve of her interference with his orphanage, didn't believe a woman her age should be raising children. But now she had resources he couldn't easily dismiss. She had property, income, savings, and soon she'd have enough money to make any objections based on financial instability irrelevant. The next morning, she went to see Sheriff Brennan. I need to understand the legal process for adoption, she said. Every detail, every requirement, every possible objection that might be raised. I need to be prepared for whatever Calhoun throws at me. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're serious about this? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. All right then. He pulled out a thick book of territorial law. Let's make sure you're ready. They spent the next 2 hours going through every statute, every regulation, every precedent. Margaret took careful notes, asked detailed questions, and began building her case the way a lawyer would. She would demonstrate financial stability, character references, suitable housing, and most importantly, that adoption served the best interest of the child. That last point would be crucial. If she could show that Sarah thrived in her care, that the bond between them was genuine and beneficial, that separating them would harm the child, then Calhoun's personal objections would matter less than Sarah's welfare. There's one more thing, Sheriff Brennan said as she was preparing to leave. The territorial judge who approves adoptions, Judge Harlan Pierce. He's a traditional man, set in his ways. He believes strongly in conventional family structures. A single woman your age adopting, he's going to be skeptical. Then I'll change his mind, Margaret said firmly. How? By showing him what love looks like. By proving that families come in all different forms. By making him see Sarah as a person who deserves a mother, not as a legal technicality to be debated. The sheriff smiled slightly. You know, when you first came to Cedar Falls, I thought you were just another widow looking for security. I underestimated you. Most people do, Margaret said. I'm used to it. As she walked back to the cabin, Margaret felt lighter than she had in days. The path ahead was still difficult, still uncertain. But at least now she had resources to fight with. At least now she had a clear goal and the means to pursue it. The money from Ohio would arrive within a month or two. In the meantime, she would prepare. She would document everything: Sarah's visits, her progress, their bond. She would gather character references from every respected person in town. She would make the cabin as presentable as possible. She would build an unassailable case for why she should be allowed to adopt, and if Calhoun still said no, if the judge still refused, then she would find another way. She would appeal. She would petition the territorial government. She would write to newspapers if she had to. She would not give up. That night, lying in bed, Margaret thought about the twist of fate that had brought her that letter. Her great-aunt Josephine, a woman she barely remembered, had given her a gift beyond measure. Not just money, but possibility. The chance to build something real. The resources to fight for what mattered. She touched the silver locket at her throat. Soon, very soon, she would have a picture to put inside it. Sarah's face, captured by the traveling photographer who came through Cedar Falls twice a year. A permanent reminder of the family she'd built from love and determination and refusal to accept limitations. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin it was warm. And for the first time since Thomas and Emma died, Margaret felt truly hopeful about the future. The money arrived in early March, just as the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the prairie grass. $840, more than Margaret had imagined. The lawyer's letter explained that the Ohio property had sold quickly to a family eager to settle near Cleveland, and that after all fees and expenses, this was her inheritance. Margaret stood in the cabin holding the bank draft, her hands shaking slightly. This piece of paper represented freedom, security, and the power to shape her own future. More importantly, it represented Sarah's future. The first thing she did was hire a carpenter from the next town over, someone skilled enough to do the work, properly but distant enough that he wouldn't bring the prejudices of Cedar Falls to the job. Together, they drew up plans to expand the cabin significantly. They would add 2 proper bedrooms, enlarge the main room, build a covered porch, and construct a small addition that could serve as a schoolroom or sewing area. "This is ambitious," the carpenter said, reviewing the plans. "Going to take 2 months, maybe more, and it'll cost you near $300 for materials and labor." "That's fine," Margaret said. "When can you start?" "Soon as the ground thaws enough to set the foundation posts. 2 weeks, maybe 3. While waiting for construction to begin, Margaret threw herself into preparing for the adoption application. She visited Sarah at the orphanage every other day now, and she carefully documented each visit in a leather journal she'd purchased specifically for this purpose. She noted what they did together, what they talked about, how Sarah was progressing in her studies, and evidence of their bond. March 8th. Read poetry together for an hour. Sarah recited "The Road Not Taken" from memory. She'd been practicing all week. We discussed the meaning of choices and paths in life. She asked if I thought she'd been on the wrong road before, but was now on the right one. I told her that all roads teach us something, even the difficult ones. March 12th. Sarah helped me plant early spring vegetables in the garden. She remembered everything I taught her last month about soil preparation and spacing. She suggested we plant extra so we could share with other families. Her generosity of spirit continues to amaze me. March 15th, difficult day. Sarah overheard Mr. Calhoun telling another child that adoption applications from unmarried women are rarely approved. She was quiet and withdrawn during our visit. I reassured her that I would not give up no matter what obstacles we face. By the end of our time together, she was smiling again. Ellen helped Margaret gather character references. They approached people strategically, not just friends like Ruth and Adelaide, but respected community members whose word would carry weight. Sheriff Brennan wrote a detailed letter attesting to Margaret's integrity and capability. The minister's wife, despite her husband's connection to Calhoun, privately admitted that she'd been impressed by Margaret's work with the orphans and provided a supportive reference. Even Jacob Mills, the widower who'd proposed a practical marriage, wrote a letter. Though Mrs. Holloway declined my offer of marriage, she did so with grace and clear reasoning, he wrote. She's a woman of principle who knows her own mind. I believe she would provide excellent care for any child fortunate enough to be placed with her. Adelaide's reference was particularly strong. "I have employed Mrs. Holloway for 6 months," she wrote. "She is reliable, skilled, and possesses excellent judgment. More importantly, I have witnessed her interactions with the orphan children of this town. She treats them with dignity and genuine affection. She sees their potential rather than their circumstances. In my opinion, any child adopted by Margaret Holloway would be receiving not merely a home, but a true mother." By early April, construction on the cabin was well underway. The carpenter had brought 2 assistants, and the sounds of sawing and hammering filled the days. The structure was taking shape, larger, sturdier, more substantial. Margaret could envision Sarah in one of the new bedrooms, could imagine meals shared around an expanded table, could picture a future that felt increasingly real. But as the physical preparations progressed, Margaret became aware of growing opposition. Mr. Calhoun had not responded to her letter announcing her intention to apply for adoption. Instead, he'd begun spreading word through town that he had serious concerns about Margaret's application, that he questioned whether a woman of her age could properly handle the responsibilities of motherhood, that he worried about the influence of Miss Whitmore, an unmarried schoolteacher, on a young girl's development. His objections were coded in concern, but rooted in something darker, a belief that women like Margaret and Ellen, who'd built lives outside traditional marriage, were somehow suspect, that their independence itself was a kind of moral failing. Margaret heard about his campaign through Ruth, who heard it from customers at the boarding house. "He's been talking to Judge Pierce," Ruth reported. "They had dinner together last week at the hotel. Calhoun's building his case against you before you even submit the formal application. Then I'll build a stronger case for myself," Margaret said. But privately, she felt the weight of opposition settling on her shoulders. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of meeting requirements and filling out forms. This was going to be a fight. She sought advice from Ellen, Adelaide, and Sheriff Brennan. They gathered at the cabin one evening after the construction crew had left for the day. Sitting around the table in the main room that smelled of fresh sawdust and new wood. "Calhoun's strategy is to paint you as unconventional," Sheriff Brennan explained. "He'll argue that a child needs a traditional family structure, a mother and a father, that Sarah would be better off waiting for a married couple to adopt her. But there are no married couples interested in adopting Sarah," Margaret countered. "She's been at that orphanage for years. She's been passed through multiple foster families. No one wants her except me." "That's a strong argument," Adelaide said. "But you need to be prepared for what Calhoun will say about that. He'll claim Sarah is difficult, that her spirit and intelligence are actually defiance and stubbornness, that a younger, more energetic mother would be better equipped to handle her. He'll also question whether you have the stamina to raise a child at your age," Ellen added. "Whether you'll be around long enough to see her into adulthood." Margaret felt anger rise. "I'm 43, not 90. I'm perfectly healthy. I could have 30 or 40 years ahead of me." "We know that," Sheriff Brennan said. "But Calhoun will use your age as a weapon. And Judge Pierce, well, he's 65 himself, but men have a way of seeing age differently in women than they do in themselves." "So what do I do?" Margaret asked. "How do I fight this?" "You focus on Sarah," Adelaide said firmly. "You make this about her needs, not about your rights. You show that adoption by you serves her best interest. That's the legal standard, best interest of the child. Everything else is secondary." Over the next few weeks, Margaret refined her strategy. She would present Sarah as a child who needed stability and love more than she needed a conventional family structure. She would emphasize their bond, documented carefully in her journal. She would demonstrate that she could provide materially, showing the expanded cabin, her steady income, her savings. And she would argue that time was of the essence, that Sarah had already suffered through years of instability and needed permanent placement now, not after more months or years of waiting for a married couple who might never materialize. She also decided to prepare Sarah for the possibility of disappointment. One afternoon in late April, as they sat together on the partially completed porch, Margaret broached the subject carefully. Sweetheart, I want to talk to you about the adoption hearing. You know it's coming up in May. Sarah nodded, her expression guarded. I know. There's a chance, a real chance, that Mr. Calhoun and the judge might say no. Not because you're not wonderful, and not because I wouldn't be a good mother to you, but because... She paused, searching for words that would be honest without destroying hope. Because some people have very fixed ideas about how families should look. You mean because you're not married? And because you're old. The bluntness stung, but Margaret didn't flinch. Yes, that's what I mean. Do you think they'll say no? I don't know. I'm going to fight as hard as I can. I'm going to present the best case possible. But I want you to be prepared just in case. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie grass that was beginning to turn green with spring growth. What happens if they say no? Then we appeal. We try again. We keep fighting until we find a way, and if that doesn't work... Margaret took Sarah's hand. Then I stay in your life in whatever way I can. I'll still visit you. I'll still be here for you. You'll still be the daughter of my heart, even if the law doesn't recognize it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That's not enough. I want to be your daughter for real. I want to live here with you and Miss Ellen. I want to have a room and a family and... Her voice broke. I want to belong somewhere. I know, sweetheart. I want that too, more than anything. They sat together in silence, holding hands, both aware that despite all of Margaret's preparations and resources and determination, the outcome was still uncertain. That other people, men who didn't know Sarah, who didn't understand what they meant to each other, would make the decision that would shape both their futures. That evening, after Sarah had returned to the orphanage, Margaret took out the mason jar of seeds that Sarah had saved for their garden. The girl had collected them painstakingly over the winter. Dried beans, squash seeds, tomato seeds carefully extracted and preserved. Seeds meant for planting together, for growing food that would nourish them both, for creating life from potential. Margaret held the jar, feeling its weight, thinking about faith and hope and the courage required to plant seeds, not knowing whether they'd have the chance to harvest what grew from them. But you planted anyway. You prepared the soil and placed the seeds and watered them and trusted that growth was possible. Even when the outcome was uncertain, the adoption hearing was scheduled for May 15th. That gave Margaret 3 more weeks to prepare, to gather any additional evidence or support, to make sure every detail of her case was perfect. She spent those weeks in a blur of activity. The cabin construction was completed, and the building inspector from the territorial office declared it sound and suitable for family occupancy. Margaret furnished Sarah's room carefully. A real bed with a feather mattress, a chest of drawers, a small desk for schoolwork, curtains she'd sewn herself in cheerful yellow fabric. On the walls, she hung some of Sarah's drawings and the poetry verses they'd copied together. She practiced her testimony with Ellen, anticipating every possible question, preparing answers that were honest and compelling. She reviewed her financial records, making sure they were clear and complete. She gathered letters of support. She now had 12, from people ranging from Adelaide and Ruth to the traveling doctor who visited Cedar Falls monthly and had observed Margaret's herbal knowledge and healing skills, and she prepared Sarah. They discussed what the hearing would be like, what questions Sarah might be asked, how to answer honestly while also expressing her true feelings. Margaret was careful not to coach the girl, but she wanted her to feel confident and prepared. The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to Ellen's steady breathing from the next room, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The grief that had brought her west, the rejection she'd faced, the day she'd first seen Sarah, the slow, difficult process of building a life that mattered, the unexpected inheritance that had given her the means to fight. All of it had been leading here, to this hearing, to this chance. Tomorrow, in a courtroom in Cedar Falls, she would make her case for why she should be allowed to become Sarah's mother. And somewhere in the orphanage, Sarah was surely lying awake too, hoping and fearing in equal measure. Margaret touched the silver locket at her throat. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow we find out if love is enough. The courthouse in Cedar Falls wasn't a grand building, just a two-story wooden structure that served multiple purposes, with the courtroom occupying the entire second floor. Margaret arrived early, dressed in her best dress, the dark grey wool she'd worn to her first church service in town, now altered to fit better and freshened with new buttons. She carried a leather folder containing all her documentation, and in her pocket she clutched the handkerchief Sarah had embroidered for her. Ellen and Ruth accompanied her, along with Adelaide, who'd closed the Silver Dollar for the morning so she could attend. Sheriff Brennan was already there, as he was required to be present for all court proceedings. And sitting near the front, looking stern and confident, was Mr. Josiah Calhoun. The room filled quickly. Margaret was surprised by how many people had come. Townsfolk who'd watched her journey from rejected widow to determined landowner. People whose opinions of her had shifted over the months. Some were clearly there out of curiosity, but others wore expressions of support. Mrs. Brennan sat with a group of women who'd helped make Christmas gifts for the orphans. Jacob Mills was there looking uncomfortable but present. Even some of the men who'd helped with the cabin construction had come. Judge Harlan Pierce entered at precisely 9 o'clock. He was a tall man with white hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades on the frontier. His expression was severe, his bearing formal. This was a man who took the law seriously, who believed in order and tradition and proper procedure. "This court is now in session," he announced in a deep voice. "We are here to consider the application of Mrs. Margaret Holloway to adopt the minor child Sarah Brennan, currently residing at the Cedar Falls Orphanage under the guardianship of Mr. Josiah Calhoun. Mr. Calhoun, as the child's current guardian, you will present first." Calhoun stood, holding papers of his own. "Your Honor, I have serious reservations about this application. While I don't question Mrs. Holloway's good intentions, I believe this adoption would not serve the best interests of the child." Margaret's hands tightened on her folder, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mrs. Holloway is 43 years old," Calhoun continued. "Unmarried. She lives with another unmarried woman, Miss Ellen Whitmore, in what some might consider an unconventional household arrangement. She has been in Cedar Falls for less than a year. While she has recently come into some property and funds, her long-term financial stability remains uncertain." He paused, glancing at Margaret before continuing. "More concerning is the child in question. Sarah Brennan is a difficult girl. She has been placed with multiple families and returned each time due to behavioral issues, defiance, stubbornness, an unwillingness to accept proper authority. She requires firm guidance from a traditional family structure, preferably with both a mother and father figure. Mrs. Holloway, despite her admirable qualities, is simply not equipped to provide what this particular child needs." "I see," Judge Pierce said. "And what alternative do you propose? Are there married couples interested in adopting Sarah?" Calhoun hesitated. "Not at present, Your Honor, but with patience and proper presentation, I'm confident we can find an appropriate placement." "How long has Sarah been available for adoption?" Another hesitation. "Approximately 3 years, Your Honor. And in those 3 years, how many married couples have expressed interest in adopting her?" "The specific number—" "How many, Mr. Calhoun?" "None, Your Honor, but that doesn't mean—" Judge Pierce held up a hand. "We'll return to that point. Mrs. Holloway, you may present your case." Margaret stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She'd practiced this, prepared for this moment. "Your Honor, I came to Cedar Falls nearly a year ago as a widow seeking a new beginning. I'd lost my husband and daughter to scarlet fever, and I was searching for purpose, for a way to matter again. I found that purpose in Sarah Brennan." She opened her folder, pulling out the journal where she'd documented their time together. "This journal contains records of every visit I've made to Sarah over the past 6 months. It shows a child who is not defiant but intelligent, not stubborn but principled, not difficult but spirited. Sarah has been failed by the system that's supposed to protect her, passed from home to home, valued only for her labor, never for herself." Judge Pierce accepted the journal, beginning to page through it. "His expression was unreadable," Margaret continued. I am 43 years old. Mr. Calhoun presents this as a liability. I present it as an asset. I have life experience. I understand loss and resilience. I have patience that perhaps I didn't have when I was younger. I have skills accumulated over decades: cooking, sewing, healing with herbs, managing a household efficiently. I have the financial means to provide for Sarah properly, as these documents show. She handed him a detailed accounting of her savings, her property, her income sources, and her expenses. Everything was meticulously organized, clearly presented. I own 10 acres of land with a substantially improved dwelling. I have steady employment. I have $800 in savings, more than enough to weather unexpected difficulties. I have a support network of friends and community members who have witnessed my dedication to Sarah and who support this adoption. She pulled out the stack of reference letters. 12 people have written on my behalf, Your Honor, not because I asked them to say nice things, but because they have observed my character and my capability over the past year. Judge Pierce accepted the letters, setting them aside to read later. You mentioned loss, your husband and daughter. Tell me about them. Margaret felt her throat tighten, but pushed through. Thomas was a good man. We were married for 15 years. Emma was 10 years old when she died, the same age Sarah is now. Losing them nearly destroyed me. For years, I merely existed. I had no purpose beyond getting through each day. Coming west was a last desperate attempt to find some reason to keep living. And you found that reason in this child. Yes, Your Honor, but not in the way you might think. I'm not trying to replace Emma. Sarah is her own person, unique and irreplaceable. What Sarah gave me was the reminder that I still have something to offer. That my years of experience, my capacity for love, my willingness to fight for what matters, all of that still has value. And what I can give Sarah is a mother who sees her for who she truly is, not who others think she should be. She took a breath, meeting the judge's eyes directly. Sarah has been told she's too difficult, too spirited, too intelligent for her own good. She's been punished for asking questions, for defending herself, for wanting to be seen as a person rather than as free labor. What she needs is someone who celebrates those qualities instead of trying to crush them. Someone who believes that a girl can be smart and strong and still be loved. The courtroom was silent. Judge Pierce studied her for a long moment. Strong words, Mrs. Holloway, but good intentions don't always translate to good outcomes. Mr. Calhoun raises a valid concern about your age. How can you assure this court that you will be physically capable of raising this child through her adolescence and into adulthood? I'm in excellent health, Your Honor. I work 5 days a week at physically demanding labor. I maintain a home and a garden. I have more energy and stamina than many younger women I know. But more importantly, she paused, choosing her words carefully. If we only allowed people to become parents when we could guarantee they'd live to see their children grown, very few people would qualify. Life offers no such guarantees. What I can guarantee is that for however many years I have, Sarah will be loved, supported, valued, and given every opportunity to become the remarkable woman I know she can be. Judge Pierce made a note on his papers. We'll now hear from character witnesses. Sheriff Brennan, I see you've submitted a letter. Would you speak to your observations? Sheriff Brennan stood. Your Honor, I've known Mrs. Holloway since she arrived in Cedar Falls. Initially, I'll admit, I underestimated her. I saw another widow looking for security, someone who'd likely move on when she didn't find it. But I was wrong. Margaret Holloway is one of the most determined, capable people I've encountered. When she saw injustice, children being mistreated, being undervalued, she didn't look away. She spoke up, even when it made her unpopular. She's proven herself to be a woman of integrity and courage. Adelaide was called next. Her testimony was measured but powerful, emphasizing Margaret's reliability, her skills, and most importantly, her genuine love for Sarah. I've watched their relationship develop over months, Adelaide said. This isn't sentiment or impulse. This is deep, abiding commitment. Margaret sees Sarah not as a project or a replacement for her lost daughter, but as a unique individual worthy of love and respect. Ruth McAllister spoke next. describing Margaret's character, her resilience in the face of rejection, and her gradual integration into the community. "She came here with nothing but determination and hope," Ruth said. "She's built a life through hard work and integrity, and she's done it all while keeping her focus on what truly matters, giving a child a loving home." Ellen Whitmore's testimony addressed the concern about their living arrangement. "Your Honor, Mrs. Holloway and I share a home for practical reasons. We're both single women who benefit from pooling resources. But make no mistake, Margaret is fully capable of independent living and parenting. I'm her housemate and friend, not a substitute parent. If this adoption is approved, my role will be that of a supportive aunt figure, nothing more." Throughout the testimonies, Judge Pierce listened carefully, occasionally making notes, his expression giving nothing away. Margaret could feel the tension in the room, could see Sarah sitting near the back with one of the orphanage matrons, the girl's face pale and anxious. When the character witnesses had finished, Judge Pierce said, "I'd like to hear from Sarah herself." "Young lady, please come forward." Sarah stood, her legs visibly shaking as she walked to the front of the courtroom. She looked so small, so vulnerable, standing there in her worn dress with her hair neatly braided. Margaret wanted desperately to go to her, to offer comfort, but could only watch and hope. "Sarah," Judge Pierce said, his voice gentler than it had been before, "I need to ask you some questions. I want you to answer honestly. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said quietly. "How long have you known Mrs. Holloway?" "Since last September." "About 8 months. And how did you meet?" Sarah's voice grew slightly stronger. "At the town social gathering, Mrs. Gunderson, the family I was living with then, she was yelling at me because I spilled some stew. Mrs. Holloway stepped in. She defended me. No one had ever done that before. Tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Holloway. What do you do together?" "We read poetry. We talk about books and ideas. She teaches me things. How to garden, how to cook, how to think about the world. She listens to me. She doesn't get angry when I ask questions or when I have opinions." Sarah's hands twisted together. "She makes me feel like I matter, like who I am is enough. Mr. Calhoun suggests you've had behavioral problems in previous placements. Is that true?" Sarah's chin lifted slightly, that defiant spark Margaret had first seen in her eyes showing through. "The families I lived with wanted workers, not daughters. They wanted me to be quiet and obedient and grateful. When I asked questions or tried to learn things or defended myself when I was treated unfairly, they said I was difficult. Maybe I was. Maybe wanting to be treated like a person instead of like property makes me difficult." There was a murmur through the courtroom. Judge Pierce raised his hand for silence. "And with Mrs. Holloway, are you difficult with her?" "No, sir, because she doesn't treat me like I'm a problem to be managed. She treats me like I'm a person to be valued. When you're valued, you don't need to fight for basic respect. If this adoption is approved, you would live with Mrs. Holloway and Miss Whitmore. How do you feel about that?" For the first time, Sarah smiled. "I would be the luckiest girl in Cedar Falls. I'd have a mother who loves me, a home where I belong, and a chance to be myself. That's all I've ever wanted." Judge Pierce studied her for a long moment. "Thank you, Sarah. You may return to your seat." As Sarah walked back, she glanced at Margaret, and in that look was everything: hope, fear, love, and desperate trust that somehow this would work out. Judge Pierce shuffled through his papers, reviewing the journal, the financial documents, the reference letters. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, broken only by the sound of pages turning and the judge's pen scratching occasional notes. Finally, he looked up. "This is not a simple case," he said. "The law requires that adoption serve the best interest of the child. That standard must guide my decision above all else." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. "Mr. Calhoun argues that Sarah needs a traditional family structure," Judge Pierce continued, "that Mrs. Holloway's age and unmarried status make her unsuitable. These are not invalid concerns. Convention exists for reasons, and deviation from convention should not be undertaken lightly." Margaret felt hope beginning to slip away. The judge was setting up to deny the adoption. She could hear it in his tone. "However," Judge Pierce said, and that single word changed everything. "The law does not say a child must have a conventional family. It says a child must have what is best for that particular child. And after reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony, I must ask myself, what is best for Sarah Brennan?" Judge Pierce continued, his voice measured and thoughtful. "This child has been in the orphanage system for 3 years. She has been placed with 4 different families, each of which returned her, citing behavioral problems. In 3 years, not a single married couple has expressed interest in adopting her. Mr. Calhoun suggests we should wait patiently for such a couple to appear. But I must ask, how much more patience should a 10-year-old child be expected to have?" He picked up Margaret's journal, holding it up slightly. "This document shows 6 months of consistent, devoted attention. Weekly visits, sometimes more. Activities designed to nurture the child's mind and spirit. Evidence of genuine affection and commitment. Mrs. Holloway did all of this before she had any guarantee of approval, before she inherited the means to make adoption financially viable. She did it simply because she cared." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but forced them back. She needed to hear every word, needed to understand where the judge was going. "As for the concern about Mrs. Holloway's age," Judge Pierce said, and now there was something almost personal in his tone, "I find that argument particularly unconvincing. I'm 65 years old. My wife is 62. We raised our last child into adulthood when we were older than Mrs. Holloway is now. Did our age make us less capable parents? I would argue the opposite. We had patience we lacked in our youth. We had perspective. We had life experience that allowed us to guide our children with wisdom earned through our own mistakes and triumphs." He set down the journal and looked directly at Margaret. "Age is not always a liability, Mrs. Holloway. Sometimes it is exactly what a situation requires. A spirited, intelligent child like Sarah might benefit more from a mother who has lived long enough to value those qualities, rather than a younger person who might see them as problems to be corrected." Margaret could barely breathe. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? Judge Pierce turned his attention to the papers before him, reviewing them one final time. "I have read 12 character references, all of them strong, all of them speaking to Mrs. Holloway's integrity, capability, and genuine love for this child. I have reviewed detailed financial records showing that she has the means to provide adequately for Sarah's material needs. I have examined documentation of a home that is suitable and stable." He paused, looking at Sarah. "Most importantly, I have listened to a child who has articulated clearly and eloquently what she needs, not a conventional family structure, but a mother who sees her, values her, and loves her for who she is. Sarah Brennan has been failed by conventional placements. Perhaps what she needs is something less conventional, but more genuine." Calhoun stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object." "You may object, Mr. Calhoun, but your objection is noted and overruled. The law is clear. The standard is best interest of the child, not best interest of convention or tradition. And in this case, those interests diverge." Judge Pierce picked up his pen, and Margaret watched as he began to write on an official form. The scratching of the pen seemed impossibly loud in the silent courtroom. "It is the finding of this court," Judge Pierce said as he wrote, "that the adoption of Sarah Brennan by Margaret Holloway serves the best interest of the child. The application is approved, pending a standard 1-year probationary period during which the Territorial Family Services Office will conduct regular check-ins to ensure the placement is successful." The courtroom erupted. Some people applauded. Others murmured in surprise or disapproval. Margaret heard none of it. She was staring at the judge, at the paper he was signing, trying to understand that this was real, that it was happening. "The probationary period will require monthly visits from a family services representative," Judge Pierce continued, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. "Mrs. Holloway, you will be expected to maintain detailed records of Sarah's schooling, health, and general welfare. At the end of 1 year, if all is satisfactory, the adoption will be finalized and permanent. Do you understand these conditions?" Yes, Your Honor, Margaret managed, her voice shaking. I understand. Sarah Brennan, Judge Pierce said, looking at the girl. From this moment forward, you are placed in the custody of Margaret Holloway. She is your legal guardian, and if all goes well during this probationary year, she will be your mother in the eyes of the law. Do you understand? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Judge Pierce signed the final document with a flourish, pressed his seal into the wax, and handed it to Margaret. Congratulations, Mrs. Holloway. You are now Sarah's mother. Margaret took the document, the official certificate of guardianship, soon to become an adoption certificate, with trembling hands. She stared at it, at the legal words that meant Sarah was hers, that they were family now in the eyes of the law, as they'd been in her heart for months. Then Sarah was there, running to her, throwing her arms around Margaret's waist and holding on with desperate strength. Margaret knelt down, pulling the girl close, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. We did it, Sarah whispered against her neck. We're really a family. Really a family, Margaret confirmed, her voice choked with emotion. Really forever. Around them people were approaching, Ruth and Ellen and Adelaide, all crying and congratulating them. Sheriff Brennan shook Margaret's hand firmly, his eyes suspiciously bright. Even some of the townspeople who'd been skeptical came forward to offer good wishes. Mr. Calhoun stood to the side, his face a mask of disapproval, but he said nothing. The judge had spoken. The law had been satisfied. There was nothing more he could do. As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Pierce called Margaret back. Mrs. Holloway, a moment, please. Margaret approached the bench, Sarah still clinging to her hand. I want to be clear about something, Judge Pierce said quietly. This probationary year is not mere formality. You will be watched closely. There will be those, he glanced meaningfully toward where Calhoun was gathering his papers, who will be looking for any sign of failure, any excuse to challenge this placement. You must be beyond reproach. Document everything. Maintain the highest standards. Do you understand? I understand, Your Honor, and I will. Sarah deserves nothing less than my absolute best, and that's what I'll give her. I believe you will. He looked at Sarah. And you, young lady, this is your chance for a real home. Don't squander it. Work hard in school. Be respectful. Show that you were worth fighting for. I will, Your Honor, Sarah said solemnly. I promise. As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright May sunshine, Margaret felt as if she were walking in a dream. The document was still in her hand, proof that this was real. Sarah walked beside her, and on her other side, Ellen linked arms with both of them. Shall we go home? Ellen asked, and the word home had never sounded so beautiful. Yes, Margaret said. Let's go home. They walked through town, and people stopped to watch them pass. The 43-year-old woman who'd been deemed too old for marriage, the spinster school teacher, and the difficult orphan girl that no one had wanted. 3 women building a family that didn't fit conventional patterns, but was no less real, no less valid for its difference. When they reached the cabin, Sarah's home now, officially and legally, they found Ruth and Adelaide already there, having rushed ahead to prepare a celebration. There was food laid out on the table, flowers in jars, and a cake that Adelaide had somehow managed to acquire from the hotel bakery. A proper celebration for a proper family, Ruth declared. Pulling Sarah into a hug, they ate and laughed and cried, the small cabin filled with joy and relief and the sense of something momentous having occurred. Sarah couldn't stop touching things, the walls, the table, the curtains, as if grounding herself in the reality of belonging here. Later, when the visitors had gone and twilight was settling over the prairie, Margaret showed Sarah to her room, her own room prepared and waiting for this moment. Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at the bed with its colorful quilt, the chest of drawers, the desk, the curtains, the drawings on the walls. This is really mine, she whispered. Really yours. Your space, your sanctuary, your home. Sarah walked in slowly, reverently, running her hand over the quilt. I've never had my own room before. Never had anything that was just mine. You have a whole life now that's yours, Margaret said. And you have a mother who will do everything in her power to make sure you have what you need to build that life into something wonderful." Sarah turned to her, fresh tears on her cheeks. "Can I call you Mother?" "Not Mrs. Holloway. Mother." Margaret's throat closed with emotion. "I would be honored. I've been waiting to hear that word again for 5 years." "Mother," Sarah said, testing it out. Then again, with more confidence. "Mother." They stood there in the small room, mother and daughter now by law and by love, and felt the weight of all they'd overcome to reach this moment. The grief and loss that had brought them to Cedar Falls, the rejection and struggle they'd both endured, the determination that had carried them through impossible obstacles to this place of belonging. Outside, the prairie stretched out under a darkening sky, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. And inside the cabin, a new family, unconventional, hard-won, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection, was finally, truly home. The probationary year passed like water flowing over stones, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward toward permanence. The family services representative, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, visited monthly as required. She inspected the cabin, reviewed Sarah's schoolwork, asked probing questions about their routine and relationship. Margaret documented everything meticulously. Sarah's grades, her health, their activities, the growth of their bond. Each visit ended with Mrs. Patterson's grudging acknowledgement that things seemed satisfactory, though her expression suggested she expected failure at any moment. But failure never came. Sarah flourished. She threw herself into her studies with renewed energy, no longer afraid that asking too many questions or showing too much intelligence would result in punishment. Her grades improved dramatically. Miss Whitmore reported that Sarah was one of the brightest students she'd ever taught, with a particular gift for literature and mathematics. More importantly, Sarah grew in ways that couldn't be measured by grades or documented in reports. She smiled more easily. She laughed often. She began to trust that this home, this family, wouldn't disappear if she made a mistake or showed too much spirit. She learned that love didn't have to be earned through perfect behavior. It simply was, constant and unconditional. The townspeople's attitudes shifted gradually. Those who'd been skeptical of the adoption found it hard to maintain their objections when confronted with the evidence of Sarah's transformation. The difficult, defiant orphan had become a confident, thriving child. Margaret's age, once cited as a liability, proved to be exactly what Sarah needed: the patience, wisdom, and perspective that only years of living could provide. 6 months into the probationary period, something remarkable happened. Emily, the girl whose brothers had been separated from her, appeared at the cabin one Sunday afternoon. She was accompanied by Miss Whitmore, who explained that Emily had run away from the Whitakers' farm and refused to return. "She says she'd rather live at the orphanage than go back there," Ellen said quietly, while Emily stood on the porch looking both defiant and terrified. "The Whitakers work her from dawn to dark, give her barely enough food, and punish her harshly for the smallest infractions." Margaret looked at the girl, 11 years old now, thin and exhausted, with bruises on her arms and determination in her eyes. She thought about the promise she'd made 8 months ago, that Emily and her brothers would be first on her list when she had the means to help more children. "Emily," Margaret said gently, "come inside. Let's talk." Over tea and fresh bread, Emily told her story. The Whitakers had wanted a servant, not a daughter. They'd worked her relentlessly, criticized her constantly, and denied her access to school for weeks at a time. "I kept thinking about what you said," Emily whispered, "about how I'm worth more than being someone's free labor, about how I deserve to be valued. And I decided I'd rather have nothing than keep living like that." Margaret made her decision in that moment. "You'll stay here, at least temporarily, while we figure out a better solution." Ellen's eyes widened. "Margaret, we're still in the probationary period. Mrs. Patterson is looking for any excuse to challenge Sarah's placement. Taking in another child without approval. I know the risks, but I also know what's right." I can't send her back to a place where she's being abused, and I won't send her back to Calhoun's orphanage to be placed with another family that will do the same thing. She stays. That decision set off a firestorm. Mrs. Patterson appeared 2 days later, furious that Margaret had taken in another child without authorization. Calhoun filed a formal complaint, arguing that Margaret had violated the terms of her probationary period, and that Sarah should be removed from her care immediately. But this time, Margaret wasn't alone in her fight. The community that had once been skeptical rallied around her. Adelaide hired a lawyer from the territorial capital to represent Margaret. Sheriff Brennan investigated the Whitakers and found evidence of abuse that resulted in their being barred from fostering children. Ruth organized a petition signed by 50 residents attesting to Margaret's character and the positive changes in Sarah. The hearing to determine whether Sarah's placement should continue was tense. But Margaret had documentation showing that Emily's emergency placement was necessary to protect the child from harm, that she had immediately notified the proper authorities, and that she had the means and space to care for both girls. Judge Pierce, presiding again, listened to all sides before making his ruling. It is clear that Mrs. Holloway acted to protect a child in danger. While the proper procedures were not followed initially, they have been followed subsequently. More importantly, the question remains, what serves the best interest of these children? Should Sarah be removed from a home where she's thriving because her mother acted to help another child in need? Should Emily be returned to an abusive situation or warehoused in an orphanage while waiting for a placement that may never come? His answer was no on both counts. Sarah's placement would continue, and Emily would be placed officially with Margaret as a foster child, with the possibility of adoption after Sarah's probationary period was complete. The addition of Emily to the household changed the dynamics, but in beautiful ways. The two girls shared the second bedroom that had been built with expansion in mind. They became sisters, bonded by shared experiences of loss and new hope. Emily's quiet determination complemented Sarah's fierce spirit. Together they helped with household tasks, studied together, and slowly learned that family wasn't defined by blood, but by love and commitment. As the probationary year drew to a close, Margaret began working on another goal, reuniting Emily with her brothers. It took months of negotiation, legal work, and careful planning. The middle brother, Thomas, was unhappy with the Drummonds, who'd worked him hard in their store and treated him more as an employee than a son. The youngest, James, had been better treated by the Ashfords, but still missed his siblings desperately. With Adelaide's financial backing, Margaret expanded the cabin again, adding a third bedroom. The territorial government, impressed by the success of Sarah and Emily's placements, approved the transfer of both boys to Margaret's care. On a bright autumn day, nearly 18 months after Margaret first arrived in Cedar Falls, all three Hayes siblings were reunited under her roof. The moment when Emily saw her brothers again, when they all three held each other and cried with joy and relief, was one Margaret would treasure forever. 4 children. It seemed impossible, overwhelming, but with Ellen's help, with the support of the community that had slowly embraced this unconventional family, they made it work. The cabin was crowded but filled with laughter. Money was tight but sufficient. Days were exhausting but meaningful. When Sarah's adoption was finalized at the end of the probationary year, the whole town came to celebrate. The ceremony was simple but profound. Judge Pierce himself presided, signing the final papers that made Sarah officially, permanently, legally, Margaret's daughter. Margaret had brought the silver locket she'd worn empty for so many years. Inside it now was a small photograph of Sarah, taken by the traveling photographer who'd passed through town that spring. No longer empty, no longer waiting, filled with the face of her daughter, the family she'd built through determination and love. Sarah Holloway, Judge Pierce pronounced, using Sarah's new legal name. May you continue to thrive in the family you've found. The adoption certificate was sealed with wax and signatures, official and permanent. Margaret held it in her hands, This document that represented the transformation of hope into reality, of love into law, of two broken people into a family. In the 2 years that followed, Margaret formalized her arrangement with Ellen, officially establishing their household as a licensed foster home capable of housing up to 6 children. Emily's adoption was approved, as were the adoptions of her brothers. The children passed through their care, some temporarily, some permanently, all benefiting from a home that valued them as individuals, that celebrated their unique gifts, that refused to crush their spirits in the name of obedience. The cabin was expanded twice more, until it was barely recognizable from the broken-down structure Margaret had first claimed. It became known throughout the territory as a place where difficult children, children with too much spirit, too much intelligence, too many questions, could finally find acceptance. Adelaide eventually took in a teenage girl herself, discovering in the process that family came in many forms. Ruth opened part of her boarding house to female teachers and other single women who needed support and community. The town that had once dismissed older women as useless gradually learned to see their value, the experience, wisdom, and capacity for love that came with years lived fully. On a spring evening, 5 years after Margaret first arrived in Cedar Falls, she sat on the porch of her home watching the sunset. Sarah, now 15, was reading to the younger children in the yard, the poetry book they'd shared in those early days, now worn soft with use. Emily was helping Ellen prepare dinner in the kitchen. The boys were doing their evening chores, their voices carrying on the wind. Margaret touched the locket at her throat, feeling the weight of Sarah's photograph inside. But next to that photograph now was another, a family portrait taken last summer. All of them together, this family built from broken pieces. This home,